Chapter 11 of The Pathway of the Pioneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE. Chapter 11. Wherefore on these the fates shall bend, and all old idle things. Wherefore on these shall power attend, beyond the grasp of kings. Each in her place by right, not grace, shall rule her heritage. Women who simply do the work, for which they draw the wage. Rudyard Kipling. Flair's rooms measured about 12 feet by 14, and a good third of the space was choked up with papers. But their owner did not seem to feel that she was crowded out, and fiercely resented any attempt on Mrs. Bonnet's part to keep order for her, a thing that she never seemed to try to do for herself. Papers, as the rest of Nous Autres told Flair, attract both dust and beetles. But Flair remained unmoved by such warnings. She did not mind dust, and had a cockroach held out any inducement of becoming tame, she would have invited him to tea. Nothing that lived shocked Flair very much in itself, though the conditions of its breeding might strike her as too horrible to be contemplated. Not taking into account possible beetles, however, R.L. was the only person who was licensed to sit on her manuscript or disturb them as he pleased, and with a fine disregard of possible masterpieces, he made a bed of Flair's romances, and a plaything of her verse. One room, the bedroom, looked out over a sea of houses, the roofs rising and falling like waves, away to the ugly purple of the London horizon. Overhead the sky was white in fine weather, that smooth, colourless white that one so often sees in England, with a glare of light that is not exactly sunshine. It inspired Flair with two lines that never grew into any consecutive description. White skies of a sunless summer, and the long straight veil of the rain. Flair knew those high white skies of summer as well as the yellow vapours of winter, for she rarely went out of town. The second room, where she ate and wrote, and had her daylight being, looked out onto leads, and by throwing the window up as far as it would go, Flair could scramble out among the blacks and the chimney pots and see all London rolling by beneath. For her two attics were 6 flights up, and the leads of the next house jutted to a corner, and there, by a twist of good fortune, Flair could sit on a low parapet, if she did not mind smuts, and see Trafalgar Square through a blinking side street. It was a bird's eye view, and not a good one at that. A photographer would have scorned it. But it was Nelson's column and one lion, a spray of fountain and a bit of pavement, while all day and far into the night the flood tide of existence rolled and purred in traffic noises. When she was very tired indeed, nothing rested Flair like creeping through the window and along by the chimneys and so to the parapet, where she put her back against sun-warmed bricks and rested, sublimely indifferent to her old serge skirts and ink-stained blouses. Sometimes she borrowed Henley from a free library and read him there. Trafalgar Square, the fountain's volleying golden glaze, shines like an angel market high aloft, over his couchant lions in a haze, shimmering and bland and soft. A dust of chrysoprase, our sailor takes the golden gaze of the saluting sun, and flames superb, as once he flamed it on his ocean round. But I doubt if Henley, even, saw Trafalgar Square as Flair saw it. On the day of Beatrice's school breaking up, Flair went out onto the leads at sunset. It had been an intensely hot day, so that the heat seemed to hang above the earth and obscure the sunlight. But when Flair crawled out of the window among the smuts, the atmosphere had cleared sufficiently to make the square a dull gold, not the golden glory, long lapsing down a golden-coasted sky, but sunshine filtered through mist. She had had her evening meal, bread and butter and lettuce chiefly, because it was too hot to eat much, and had come out to allow the room to air. Flair always had a feeling that a room in which one had had food kept the odour of it, even though there was practically none to keep. But as far as her own share of ozone went, She might just as well have stayed inside. The reek of the streets rose slowly, and was composed of stale vegetables and drying flowers, and a horrible disinfectant which the London County Council or the local vestries were trying on the wood pavements. Flare sniffed as indifferently as a horse that knows its stable. London was as familiar to her in an olfactory sense as visually. She walked across the leads and out of the shadow of the chimney-pots into the pallid sunset, and there below her the carts and carriages swung past in a rhythm to which she wove romances. For it was as easy to Flare to endow the occupants of a passing barouche with life and history as to read a novel. They were mere dots from this distance, but so much the more like puppets of which she pulled the strings. After a few minutes she grew tired. Flare's body was generally flaccid and lacked the spring of vitality, and sat down on the parapet. One hand dropped against the dirty stucco, and a long, lean, black tomcat found her there, and after prowling about for some scared minutes, leapt up on her knee and lay down. He had surveyed her as an enemy, but she sat very still, and her eyes were the eyes of a lost friend. So as she did not even make the mistake of holding out her hand, he jumped up as he might have done on the parapet itself, and Flare stroked him gently. They were two strayed personalities, waifs in that London whose very essence seemed embodied in their quiet figures. A shabby girl with a languid face and eyes full of dreadful wisdom, and a shabby cat with every twitching sinew suggesting the life of the outlaw. He was a most disreputable cat, and the old scar on his nose was probably gained in a past battle with R.L. His very sleep was a wary one, and light enough to enable him to fly before the enemy he had always found to arrive before very long. This was probably the most domesticated hour of his life, and Flare's tired, stained hand the only one that had ever smoothed his ragged black coat. I often think that Flare must have been trying in a family circle, where she presumably lived at some period before she became a solitary tenant in the rooms off Duncannon Street. For a person who prefers to keep an amateur cat's home upon the window-sill, and becomes really ferocious if a single paper in an untidy room is properly dusted and straightened, cannot be regarded as a social character. Yet for the moment, dreaming among her chimney-pots, above the golden haze of Trafalgar Square, there was something quietly homelike about Flare with her stray friend on her knee. And to her, as well as to the cat, the hour meant something. A pause in an overdriven life, a certain gentle sadness in being glad to rest. She was probably as happy at the minute as she would ever be, for she was in no actual pain of body or mind. She was so often ailing that to be passively well seemed to her a thing for which to be very grateful, and though she had no actual joy of living and no impetus towards activity, she was at least quiescent. An unexpected acceptance of a story also had lifted the worry from her mind, secretly caused by her loan to Alma. Flare calculated with a certain margin that one spell of work would last her until another was finished, and to have her calculations thrown out by giving away half of a hard-earned sum shook her nerves for the coming weeks. She was not generous by nature, and to lend was an effort to her. Alma did her an unconscious service by forcing her to a wider virtue than her own prudence, while the knowledge of her debt to Flare kept Alma within bounds and taught her to painfully save. So they helped each other in this also. But the unexpected acceptance of a manuscript and the following check had enabled Flare to see her way clearly again for 3 months, and she thanked God without words, for she prayed as naturally as she breathed. Beatrice being at the breaking up party, and Hilda with her, Flare had not looked for a gathering of the clans, but through a series of chances Nous Autres had an irregular meeting that night all the same. Flare was still sitting on the parapet when the black cat jumped down and vanished like a shadow, and guided by his finer hearing, she got up and walked leisurely back to the window. When she reached it, she found Frank, smiling rather comically from the sitting room, and evidently undecided as to whether anyone could be out there on the leads. "Hello," she said cheerfully. "Mrs. Bonnet said you were here, but I thought you must have gone out unbeknownst." "So I had," said Flare, standing outside the open window to chat. "Yes, but I did not mean in the soot fields. Flare, you will be perfectly black." "I dare say," said Flare carelessly. "Shall I come in, as you are obviously afraid of smuts on your nose?" "I came in reality rather to clean myself than to get dirtier. May I borrow a bath?" "Certainly. Go into my room and take what towels you want, and the rest of the paraphernalia. The towels are in the cupboard which I use as a linen chest. I shan't come in for half an hour more if you are going down to the bathroom. I know you will lie and soak. I'll meet you in the committee room by and by. Do you want something to eat, incidentally?" "No, dearie. I have had a nondescript tea, with a plate of ham. I shall do very well till I get home, and mother will keep some supper for me anyway." The bright face vanished, and Flare went back to the parapet, but the black cat did not reappear, and after a time the light faded out of the sky, and there was less to distract her thoughts. Flare never allowed her mind to dwell on the life she led, or those of her friends. She had a suspicion that if she did, she would go mad. She had some vague ambitions for the future, and a store of splendid memories, and on these she lived. By the time she had washed off the smuts and changed to a cleaner blouse, Frank had come out of the bathroom and was talking to another visitor, of whose arrival Flare had not known. It was Magda, and the reason for her appearance was as much of a chance as Frank's, for she had been reporting at Lord's all day, and was in need of comfort. The authorities at Lord's do not give seats to women reporters on small papers. Magda was taking a chance order from a ladies' weekly to review and sketch the dresses, who nevertheless are bound to do their work thoroughly and see the match through. But they allowed Magda a pass at the gates, which saved her a shilling each day, and she sat in the free stand between a curate and a working man, and learned more about the game than she would have done on one of the coaches drawn up against the rails. Both men were enthusiasts, and knew their subject, and Magda was friendly. They told her so much that her account was surprisingly sporting, and the dresses took a second place in the letterpress. Nevertheless, she went into the enclosure at the interval, and made shorthand notes in line which no mortal being could understand but herself, but which eventually emerged into finished black and whites of no mean quality. To watch Magda work was a gasping education, and destroyed the most sacred convictions of the unalterable methods of a journalist. 3 scrawled lines, a few cabalistic words appended, as to frills and furbelows, and a memory beyond the price of rubies, made the foundation for a realistic representation of a fancy fete or Messrs. So-and-so's spring goods. When she had finished with the promenade at Lord's, she rushed off to get a bun and a glass of lemonade at the buffet under the stand, where she was half afraid to remain because of the company. It was the 3rd day, and Magda stayed till stumps were drawn, because she had a chance of a second paragraph in a special edition, and dared not risk inaccuracy. The sun had beat on her head all day, and, in spite of the parasol, which other spectators good-naturedly allowed her, because she had an end seat, and as she left the stand with a word of thanks to her 2 friends, she realized that she had been on duty for 7 hours. "Goodbye," said the curate, lifting his sunburnt straw hat. "It was a splendid game. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did." "Good evening, miss," said the workman. "I'm glad to stretch my legs a bit. It's a long sit, ain't it?" "Good night," said Magda, meeting the shrewd, kindly eyes. "Thank you so much for all you have told me." "Oh, I didn't tell you nothing," said the workman, with a shyly pleased laugh. He hesitated a moment, and then looked at Magda without the barrier of class. "You look fagged out," he said. "I've a daughter about your age, and I'd be sorry to see her sit in the 'eat all day to write for some bloomin' rag. We uses girls cruel 'ard nowadays, it seems to me. Your daughter has something to be glad of, anyhow. A good father, said April's lady, with the quick tears in her blue eyes at the hint of kindness. She turned away quickly and ran down the steps, hurrying to get through the crowd. At the gate, however, she chanced on a man she had known during the office life in which her editor was a standing personality, a man who was reporting on a Sunday paper, and was hot-foot for Fleet Street to get his copy in. Magda spoke to him at once, and asked him to take the brief notice she had written, and leave it at the office whence the special would be issued, as he passed, and which would save her the necessity of a cab. He took it good-naturedly, asked her even as they parted how she was getting on, and left her, free to go home and rest herself. As she stood hesitating on the pavement, wondering if train or omnibus would be the cooler this breathless evening, a gentleman came leisurely out past her and hailed a hansom, evidently engaged for him. He was lighting a cigarette and pausing on the curb before entering the cab. His eyes fell on Magda, pausing also for other reasons. He looked at her for a minute beneath rather cynically lowered lids, at the flushed tire of her face, the notebook in her pretty hands. She had not waited to put on her gloves. The fountain pen hanging in its leather case amongst the laces of her blouse. He saw the English blue eyes looking wistfully at the cabs and carriages carrying off their fortunate owners, and perhaps he guessed at her hesitation. Anyhow, he turned round and raised his hat. "Are you by chance going south?" he said easily. "I am driving to Pall Mall, and I should be very glad to offer you a seat, if you would like it." Magda looked up in amazement, hardly knowing how to deal with the invitation. It was pleasantly spoken, and he was not dangerous in appearance. A man who was not very young, either, with a rather weary face, and quiet air of good living and good breeding about him. She remembered, with the faithfulness of a journalistic memory, seeing him in conversation with one of the coach parties, and wondering who he was. There was nothing offensive to take hold of in his manner, but there was a certain leisureliness, almost a languor, in both his voice and his movements. For a minute she was going to accept. The rest and ease of the cab would have been merciful to her after the heat and tire, and she could ask him to put her down at Piccadilly Circus, and go on from there to some friends whom she wanted to see. Why should she refuse a good offer? There was nothing against it. Nothing, except Magda had learned that no sermon is so well preached as an example. She had certain principles which she had found necessary in life, and the rest of her friends knew that she held them and kept to them. There might be no harm in accepting a stranger's invitation to drive with him. Winnie would have done so for the devilment of the thing, Alma likewise. Beatrice might have consented for the mere hint of romance, and something out of the common in it. To Frank and Flare it would probably not have been offered. Hilda would have refused. But the point in Magda's mind was, not that her friends would have condemned it in her, but that it was a concession to license. Nous Autres do not preach to each other, Flare's sermon being only gained by mutual demand. But they claim to be women who walk with clean feet through the streets of experience. The one who had said goodbye to them was Winnie. Winnie was the first who had occurred to Magda's mind as sharing this stranger's hansom. "No thanks," she said quietly, the eyes that were still a little moist from the workman's kindness threatening to fill again, half with the physical disappointment born of her tire, half because she felt the sharp contrast of the workman's daughter to herself. What would the father, who would not let his daughter overtax her womanhood even, have said to her being offered a ride because she was alone? "I am going home," she said desperately, and walked swiftly away, leaving the stranger to think what he pleased. It is probable that he meant no harm by his offer, though he might have thought that there would be a certain novelty and amusement in the passing companionship of the girl to whom he had offered a lift. But supposing Alma or Beatrice or Frank should have passed and seen Magda driving with him. At first she could have said he was a friend, but it was not her fashion to speak in generalities, or to lie. So Magda went home by train, but halfway there she altered her mind, and feeling the need of comfort, changed for Charing Cross. She had a much longer, hotter journey than she would have done had she gone straight home, but her housemate, Deb, was out tonight, and Magda was a gregarious animal and feared empty rooms. Flare, at least, would be at home. Nous Autres could generally calculate on that in the evenings, for Flare had no social life, and went nowhere, save to an occasional theatre. She had discovered that a general acquaintance is a handicap to work, and that if she visited, it meant not only the expense of better clothes, but took up time, and was a hindrance. You cannot serve art and society. Flare worked really hard and faithfully, the only drawback to her plan being that to write one must first live, and she was simply drawing on her store of splendid memories and absorbing no new experience. By degrees her copy would become lifeless and not worth the paper it was written on, save from those living touches taken from her friends. As she hated the effort of going out, however, and found that it paid her best for the moment to stop at home and write, or read for the sake of writing, Flare was to be counted upon in her rooms, and Magda was not disappointed. More, she found Frank there, and rejoiced in the extra company. "I'm expecting Alma, too," said Flare, as she dropped into the deck chair which she had brought down, and mutely invited R.L. to join her. "She is off on Friday with the Cottesmore crowd, and is coming to say good-bye. Dined, Magda?" "No, I'm starving. Flare, may I go up and find something to eat and bring down a chair?" "Do. I'll stay and entertain the clean and shining Frank. I can see soap and water glistening in every pore." "That's because you are enviously dirty," said Frank, settling herself in the only other chair that Flare had listlessly dragged down the many flights of stairs. "She was sitting on the leads, Magda, with so many blacks on her face that I thought at first it was the sweep taking a rest from labor among the chimney pots." "Someone else was taking a rest, too," said Flare lazily. "R.L. can scent him now. There was a most disreputable old Tom who came and talked to me." "Don't be silly, R.L. I have no doubt he is an intimate friend of yours. It's absurd to pretend I have consorted with strangers." But R.L., with a ringed paw on her knee, sniffed fastidiously. In spite of the summer, his own coat was watered satin compared with the black cat's. "I don't like the smell of him," he said plainly, and dropped his paw from Flare's knee without jumping up. "We have to pay by our established loves for following wandering fires." "I call that mean," said Flare, lighting a cigarette to console herself. "And you scratched him on the nose. You know you did." "Vulgar beast," said R.L., and went and sat on the bare table in the window, lashing his tail. He was always haunted by a dread which besets an adopted pet, that Flare would take another stray into her capacious heart, and he should be ousted. Had he been a pampered kitten, and owned by an adorer from the first, he would have had no doubts. One knows the air of a cat or dog who has been taught his own value from birth, as well as the converted strays. But R.L. had had buffets in his life which had built him up a noble constitution, and spoilt his assurance. It was an anxiety of Flare's lest he should ever come to Ishmael's portion again, and she did not see how to guard against it. As long as she lived, she knew that R.L. Stevenson, of the black tabby coat, was sure of half her worldly goods. But no life insurance office would have given Flare a policy, for which very reason she was not insured. "By the way," said Magda, pausing on the threshold to watch the altercation with R.L., "what am I to eat, or to leave alone, Flare?" "There is half a loaf of bread and some butter," said Flare thoughtfully. "Leave me enough for tomorrow's breakfast, that's all. And potted meat, and I don't think I finished the lettuce. You will find 2 or 3 eggs, and the saucepan and spirit stove all in the right-hand cupboard. Don't forget the water. Alma nearly burned the bottom out of the saucepan last time she honored me by dining here. And you can have marmalade if you want sweets." "Do? Beautifully. Oh, and—" Flare looked at Magda's face with keen, sleepy eyes. "Kindly oblige me by helping yourself to whiskey and soda, and bring the rest down here. Tumblers are in the left-hand cupboard." Magda departed, laughing, to refresh, and came back after some 20 minutes to find that Alma had arrived in the meanwhile. It was a scratch meeting, but they threw open the window and forbore to light up on account of the heat. and so smoked and gasped in the hot darkness for lack of better entertainment. "Shall I send you a jar of potted meat, Flare, or will you come and meal with me, and take it all out together?" said Magda practically. "I believe I have borrowed 2 meals of you." "Do you mean to tell me that you have eaten 6 pennyworth of potted meat?" said Flare solemnly. "Because if so, I am afraid serious consequences will ensue. What have you been doing all day?" "Reporting at Lord's." "Don't be silly. I must pay you back, and I can't send less than a jar." "But how will you manage about the rest of it?" said Flare teasingly. "You owe me at least 3 lettuce leaves, 2 slices of bread, if I know anything of your appetite, a pennyworth of butter, and 1 of marmalade. The whiskey and soda doesn't count, because you stood me some horrible drink the other day when we met at a report on that sale of Irish lace. It was an ice cream soda, and I will never give you another. It is base ingratitude to forget anything so divine. I don't forget the consequences anyway. I went to see my doctor promptly next day." "Then you owe me a debt of obligation. You know you adore your doctor, and would do anything for an excuse to go and see him." "He and my publisher are the only gentlemen whom I know," said Flare amicably. "When I feel doubtful of the term, I go and call on one or the other, lest I should forget that such a thing exists. All the rest are if-baffs." "It's because you never go out. Why don't you make your own circle? It is dreadfully bad for you, living in yourself as you do." "Because I hate the people I should have to know. The people in much the same class as myself, only a little better off perhaps. And if I could meet those who do interest me, they would be in an entirely different position to myself, and that is an insuperable barrier. It is a great mistake to go out of your sphere." "I don't see that you can go out of your sphere if you go into a better class of society," said Frank as abruptly as if she spoke with an effort. "You are simply educating yourself up to something above you. It's when you associate with a class below that the pinch comes." Dick, you see, had left his indelible mark, of humiliation, if not of remorse. "I agree with you, Frank. I don't mind knowing anyone who is above me in station, so called. But I very much object to its being the other way." This was Magda, of course. "That is personal prejudice, but so long as I am a lady, I see nothing to prevent my mixing with any class, and it's doing me no harm." "Well, I do," said Flare with obstinate dryness, "for my own comfort at least. If you married a man who was well off and well connected tomorrow, Magda, I should drop out of your life. I can't afford the luxury of a social acquaintance." "Flare! Well then, I should be very hurt and very angry. Why should you hold my friendship so cheaply?" "Not cheaply, my dear," Flare answered a little sadly, "only inevitably removed under such circumstances by the unwritten laws of civilization. We are outside the pale, Nous Autres, and as long as we remain Nous Autres, we have no affinity with the men and women who make the world of the real girls. If you made such a marriage as I said, you would have different interests and a different atmosphere, and we should drift apart. That is all. I know that many women who may be classed among Nous Autres lead a very busy social life, and know a great number of people, but there is always a certain bohemianism on the underside of it, and their hostesses, I believe, hesitate every time they add their names to a guest list." "Well, what can you expect?" said Alma, with a gay shrug of her shoulders. "You ask a girl to your house when you give a respectable dinner party, and you send her down with a man who, last night, saw her having supper at Prince's about 2 o'clock in the morning. You must own that the situation has its charms. That is just why I don't go out to supper unless I have an older woman with me," said Magda practically. "But I grant that many women do it, and they are none the worse. No, but the fact remains that they are taking a liberty with social laws. If you think the game is worth the candle, and like such amusements better than the respectable dinner party, then I think you are quite right to choose for yourself. But I agree with Flare so far that I don't think you can quite combine the 2 lives. Personally, I prefer my liberty said Alma, with a little laugh that bubbled like champagne. But Flare doesn't go to suppers, and yet she will not try to get into the conventional groove she approves, Magda protested in aggravated tones. Her attitude seems to be this: I am one of Nous Autres, therefore I am a bohemian and unfit for society. But I hate bohemianism, and so I shan't be even that. Flare was saved defending herself by the arrival of another unexpected member, Hilda Romaine, who had come on from her experience at Beatrice breaking up, and dined on her way at the Roche. It had been a hot meal, and the atmosphere had offended her, but it was not only that shadowed her beautiful face. You are just in time, Frank said gaily. Magda and Flare are about to tear each other to pieces because they cannot agree about our social position. I'll run upstairs and get you a chair, shall I, old lady? Come and sit in mine meanwhile, and pass judgment on the combatants. Don't trouble. The packing case is good enough for me, said Hilda, seating herself thereon. It is late, my children, and I am only shedding the passing light of my countenance upon you. I came in for 5 minutes to chat with Flare. What is the meaning of this conclave? It's a scratch, Flare explained briefly. We didn't mean to meet. Frank came round to borrow a bath, and Magda dropped in because she wanted to quarrel with someone. Magda shook her fist. And Alma came to say goodbye. She goes tomorrow for 3 months. Flare sighed below her breath. Good luck, Alma, Hilda said kindly. I hope you'll have a good time. What is the discussion on tonight? We were talking about going out of our sphere, said Frank. Flare says that if Magda married and went up in the social scale, she should drop her. There was a pause because they were all waiting for a comment from Hilda, and for the moment she made none. Instead, her eyes turned to the dark of the open window, through which one could hear the occasional patter of feet belonging to some chance passer-by, and a sudden reserve seemed to have fallen like a veil upon her face. I do not think, she said at last, with an abrupt bitterness that vaguely startled her hearers, that it is a subject that need trouble us, for none of us are ever likely to be asked to better ourselves by marriage, as they so honestly say in the servant class. No man in a desirable position could want us for wives with all our imperfections on our heads. It is much more likely that the office boy or the lift man would make us an offer, from the point of view that he was perhaps bettering himself, she added with a withering sense of humor that seemed to scorch her as much as any of her hearers. And I am not sure under the circumstances that it would not be incumbent on us to take him. For the benefit of humanity and socialism, said Flare laughing. Surely you are not going, Hilda. Why, you have only just come. Tell us about Beatrice's party. There is nothing to tell. It smelt of drapers' shops, and was cheap even down to the cakes, which had been made with saffron. Beatrice was the only thing there worth looking at, and when the butchers and bakers did not obscure my view, I refreshed myself with her. The frock was a success, then? Beatrice was a success. The social instinct is so strong in Beatrice that even with such poor material as a breaking-up party of that description, she moulded it with the instinct of the perfect hostess. Wherever she was in the room, the people about her felt pleased with themselves and their entertainment. I wish Beatrice could marry a duke and live in Park Lane, said Alma regretfully. She was emitting radiance tonight from the irrepressible joy in her heart at the prospect of being on the road again. Since her illness, Alma had only been doing desultory work, special weeks and such like, and she pined for the swing of a long settled tour. 3 months at least stretched before her now, and in the glamour of her profession, the very baggage man and dresser seemed like friends to her. She was itching to be off, and already the smell of the road was in her nostrils, the dear, irrelevant life with its movement and sense of adventure, even the narrowness of the crowd which would bound her social horizon, that subtle world in itself which is stage-land, and sets its votaries apart from any other. Some sense of this finds expression in the illimitable slang which makes the theatrical profession less understandable than any other, for they must have a language of their own to denote them a peculiar people, and no dictionary standard will serve their necessity. Alma's only regret was that she should be away from her friends, and beyond recall of them, more especially of Flare, until her contract ended, and in the fullness of her heart she would fain have endowed them all with impossible happiness like a fairy godmother. Even if Beatrice married a duke, she would never forget such an experience as today's, for instance, said Hilda slowly, her eyes on the memory of Beatrice's white face and voice. At the end, she was tired, I think, or something went wrong. Oh, girls, sometimes I feel that though I were left a fortune, it would be no real good to me now. I should never get the chill of poverty out of my bones, as Magda says. No, we were born to attics, and it's better to keep to your sphere, said Frank in a dispirited tone. The weather is making us all feel low, except Alma. Let's break up. Do you come my way, Magda? They one and all hugged Alma before they left, however, and placed most of their possessions at her disposal, if she found she wanted them for the part. Flare walked down the passage with her to the hall door, and stood there for once to see them all depart, peering half curiously into the warm, flat darkness of the night. "What are you looking at?" Alma said, following her eyes. "Is there an enemy round the corner?" "One never knows," said Flare dryly. "I wondered if I had been indiscreet, and someone were sitting on the doorstep until you came out. How's the big man, Alma?" "Very beautiful," said Alma, with the simplest paganism. "He is coming to see me off tomorrow morning." "Humph! Just as well I'm not. Supposing he had turned up tonight, and the others had had escorts as well, I conclude you would have had to sort yourselves out before you started. There is generally some man hanging round Magda, and Frank has many friends." "Hilda stands as aloof as you do," said Alma. "Not quite," said Flare dryly. The old fear dawned in her eyes. She shuddered and backed against the doorpost, glancing round as if the shadow had suddenly come into view. Even as Alma called a last good night and trotted after the others, who were in advance, the girl standing on the doorstep was looking with watchful, furtive eyes to right and left, as if some dreadful danger threatened her from the quiet night. "When I come back again," Alma was saying to Frank, "it will be autumn. Perhaps it may be winter. I wonder if anything will have happened." And Frank answered, "No, nothing. We shall just go on being Nous Autres to the end of the chapter, and living the same life. It is only in books that women like ourselves come suddenly into a change of circumstances, name and fame and fortune. In real life, the girls who work simply go on working." "But there is an end, even to our chapter," said Magda. "And things do sometimes happen," said Hilda, unknowing herself a prophetess. "There's my Omni," said Alma. "Good night, girls. Write and tell me if things do happen. Addressed to Alma Craik, the Diamond Merchant Company, on the road. Don't forget." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12, Part 1 of The Pathway of the Pioneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE. Chapter 12, Part 1. She walketh veiled and sleeping, for she knoweth not her power. She obeyeth but the pleading of her heart, and the high leading of her soul unto this hour. Slow advancing, limping, creeping, comes the woman to the hour. She walketh veiled and sleeping, for she knoweth not her power. Anonymous. If it is not good for man to live alone, it is hardly more so for woman. Magda knew this from the vein of shrewd common sense that leavened the artistry of her nature, and took her friend Deb into partnership. Alma knew it also, and when she was on tour would share with another girl, both from motives of economy and sociability, unless the crowd were of the quality which Beatrice had sampled at the stage door. Frank had her mother, and Winnie had lived in boarding houses. But Flare and Beatrice, the most morbid-minded of the group, indulged in solitude, and degenerated in their manners. Flare always forgot to pass the butter at meals and slipped easily into the habit of reaching across the table for anything she wanted. Beatrice read while she ate and spoiled her digestion, while her tendency to unpunctuality made terrible strides because there was no one to consider but herself. And if she were at school at the appointed time, her home obligations were nil. But it is to be doubted whether the drawback of being by oneself were in any wise bettered by the alternative of such a household as Hilda Romane's. Hilda's life had a break in it to her own imagination, so that she saw it in two parts, the first, which was all white, bridged over to the second, which was all black, by the day when she came home from school to find that her father had married again while she remained in ignorance. Her own mother she had never known, but it was hardly wonderful that Mr. Romaine had concealed his second marriage from Hilda until it was an accomplished fact, for he was a weak man and could as little face the beautiful set mask of his tall young daughter as he could resist the vulgar, passionate woman who had married him. She had been one of the showroom young ladies in a large West End house, and retained a certain taste in dress that she called stylish, and that intensified the stamp of ill-breeding upon her. Hilda did not go back to school again. She remained at home to watch her father go slowly downhill, and to learn to keep a terrible silence through her stepmother's fits of ungovernable temper. The remainder of the household, including the quickly recurring children, who seemed to Hilda to punctuate her teens, were cowed by Mrs. Romaine as the worst-tempered person in a family will to some extent always wear down the more peace-loving. But Hilda was never cowed, though as a rule she kept silence. Sometimes, at rare intervals, her own passion flared up in a flame that transcended Mrs. Romaine's more noisy methods, and left that lady with a virtuous sense of her own meekness compared with the threatening face which Hilda carried in her furies. "Well, I'm glad at least that I have some control. I should be frightened to have a temper like Hilda's," she declared proudly. "If one of my daughters showed signs of such another, I don't know what I should do. The house wouldn't hold us all." On an average, however, Hilda's curled lips were only a little closer pressed together during her stepmother's outpourings, and there was more of scornful irony in her blue eyes than an equal rancor. She did not openly quarrel with the woman for her weak-minded father's sake. She never had, from that first awful return when she found her installed as mistress of the house, and she was on easy terms with her stepsisters, who, however, were too far removed from her in age to be either companions or confidants. It was not only in social status that Mr. Romaine appeared to deteriorate after his second marriage. His means, always moderate, became involved through her love of display, or what she termed keeping a good showy house, and before she was 20, Hilda saw things become so desperate that she looked about for work in the little leisure left her from trying to supplement the inefficient service of the slovenly household. She had a fair knowledge of the violin, and at first she tried for pupils, with the usual disheartening result. And then she thought of the concert stage, but the agents flatly told her that she might wait for years before she got engagements, and her need was pressing. Hilda was by no means a genius. She had a reasonable amount of practical knowledge, and a love for music that was perhaps a talent in itself. At any rate, it gave her the perseverance to try to play well whatever she attempted, and the long patience of her work for 8 or 9 years was its own reward in a gradual mastery of her instrument. She was at least a great deal too good a player for the work she found, though she might be no soloist. The same agents who had refused her concert work offered her the position of second violin in a ladies' orchestra, and Hilda took it thankfully, and earned her first guinea by no means with ease, for her companions were as little to her taste as her home circle. She had played in many ladies' orchestras since then, and had seen as many ups and downs as the rest of Nous Autres, the most awful period in her memory being a bitter 3 months when ill luck forced her to join a quartet, who were engaged during the season in a tea shop. The other girls were jealous of Hilda because of her face and the attention she unwillingly received from the young men who thronged the tables and stared at her through clouds of foul tobacco. Nous Autres used to rally round her in those days to mitigate her discomfort, and had tea so often at the shop that they became known as habitués, more than the clerks and shop girls of the neighbourhood. It was a period that did not bear thinking over, even when it was thankfully past, and was not rendered sweeter by her stepmother's railing taunts and unvarnished criticism. Mrs. Romaine quite agreed in Hilda's working for her right to exist in an uncomfortable home, but she never lost an opportunity to sully the pride that she suspected by comments on the means to that end. Hilda struggled free of the tea shop after a while, with 2 proposals to add to her education. One was from the manager of the place, the other from a boy in an office counting-house nearby, whose wooing was conducted through the giggles of the other girls, they being privy to his suit, and assisting it by nudges and innuendos to the best of their power. Fortunately for herself, Hilda was so tall that her storm-flushed face was easily lifted over his head, but the grave Greek beauty grew shadowed with a look as of tragedy while the years passed on, each with its burden, making the likeness to the casts in the British Museum more defined. The second trial of Hilda's professional career was another series of bad chances that landed her at last at an exhibition with a self-styled troupe of Italians, whose Cockney accents and watery eyes betrayed a native right to Billingsgate rather than Venice. Hilda wore a red scarf over her bright hair and looked divine, but even the agent who got her the engagement was apologetic, and the very first good thing he heard of he honestly placed in Hilda's way. This was the Ladies' Catgut Band, in which she had played for 10 months, and whose conductor vented his hurt vanity upon her on the evening of Beatrice's burial. His fancy was really taken with Hilda's face, and his heart piqued by her indifference. But he was one of a long series of wearisome aspirants to her favour, from whom the girl turned with disillusioned eyes. Hilda had always received attention, if merely of the turning of heads as she passed, and the succession of men who had gone a step beyond and contrived to express their admiration in words she regarded as very little less than actual drawbacks in existence. "I am very strong," she had once said, and so she was, tenacious both of life and of some better fate for herself than what she had been offered, or she must long since have grown disheartened and drifted into a married life on as low a plane as her father's. She never met men with whom she cared to associate, those visiting the house being naturally her stepmother's friends, and her companions of her own sex were nous autres. The only occasions on which she saw a better or more educated class were those when the Ladies' Catgut Band was engaged to play for some soirée or a big party at a private house. The position was not exactly desirable, because the guests, with questionable manners, would come and stare at the performers quite as rudely as the customers in the tea shop had done. But they interested Hilda from an impersonal point of view, nevertheless. When even the other girls grew indignant, she could afford to laugh, something ludicrous in the position striking her irresistibly. Hilda's grim sense of humour had made life tolerable when a duller nature would have been goaded past bearing. "They behave as if we were wild beasts. I saw one woman look at you, put up her eyeglasses and say, 'Quite pretty,' as though you were a doll and could not hear," said the leader of the first violins to Hilda, red with wrath, as they compared notes during the interval which divided the programme in 2 halves. "If they think we are waxworks, they ought to pay," quoted Hilda, but perhaps she really meant it. Well, I should think she did. The first violin was a partisan of Hilda's. "But you do take it coolly. I should be furious if I were you. The idea of their daring to tell you you are quite pretty to your face, and it comes to that. My dear, I care so little what they say that even their bad manners do not shock me," said Hilda with a little sigh. Are we going to play the Julian Thorson tonight? I don't understand you, Miss Romaine, said the other girl, staring with round eyes and speaking quite honestly. I have seen you go suddenly red when the conductor was cheeky to you, as if you would like to kill him. Perhaps I should, but think how foolish that would be. We should all lose our engagements, and he would never understand what he had done. No, not even when he was dead. And after all, when he is tapping round the music stand with his baton, he is all right. And yet you don't mind these strangers in the least, went on the girl, not heeding Hilda's nonsense. But in either case you are quite consoled if we play that cavatina of Thorson's. Thorson happens to be my favourite English composer, said Hilda gently. I love his harmonies so much that I can even afford to be angelic to the rest of the world when listening to them. I always fancy that we should be friends if we met. You'd be awfully disappointed, said the first violin, screwing the D string to a dangerous sharpness. I hear he is quite elderly, and not at all English, really. His father was Swedish, I think. Lend me your rosin, will you? This bow won't bite. Hilda leaned across the empty seat dividing the first and second violins, and handed the girl her rosin. The conductor had already fled to refresh himself and be congratulated on the performance of the girls whom he had left with selfish indifference, hungry and tired, and waiting for their release. Sometimes it had happened that, owing to an ill-managed concert or some muddle of the arrangements in private houses, the ladies' band never left the platform at all, though they had 20 minutes' rest halfway through the evening. But it had never happened in the memory of any player that the conductor had been in like case. Hilda heard the second violins grumbling behind her, but she was not personally so keen upon the weak lemonade and flabby sandwiches which she knew would be her portion in the cloakroom, or a draughty passage behind the scenes. She sat on the conductor's immediate right as leader, and could talk to her vis-a-vis, the first violin, while he was out of the way. Furthermore, she was thinking of the music they were to play more than of her own appetite, for she loved her work, and all the desirable things of life to her were best expressed in her violin. One of the attractions to her of the cavatina was that it was played with the mutes, as if afar off, and suggested all sorts of beautiful images to her mind. Girls in warm-coloured silks, playing at ball in a marble court, the exquisite rich architecture of an eastern palace lifting the blue sky tent-like on its pinnacles, liquid sunset backing a tropical sea, all the ornaments of this hard brown earth that mean visual beauty, for the which her soul longed. She would really have liked to ask the composer what he had thought about as he drew the refrain from the grieving strings. Hilda enjoyed the semi-artistic evenings most, where the ladies' band had something amusing to look at, as well as being looked at in their turn. Nothing is more motley than a representative gathering of talented people, and Hilda's easily tickled mirth made her shake with silent laughter over some of the men and women who were pointed out to her as lions. They dressed, it seemed to her, in anything or everything inappropriate, and mostly soiled, and they gabbled to each other like parrots or monkeys. Now and then one saw a beautiful face or an exquisite gown, but how rarely. The notorieties seemed, on the whole, content to clothe themselves in fame. If Flair or Magda or Alma ever succeeds, we must be very careful with them at once, and crush any tendency in them to dirty draperies, said Hilda firmly to herself. There's a woman with a gilt laurel wreath, and her gown wrongly laced at the back. I hope Flair will not try to wear a laurel wreath, even in her coffin. It was at one of these gatherings that Hilda realized her desire, and saw her favourite composer in the flesh. Julian Thorson was really a great man in his profession, and the principal guest at the evening function to which the ladies' catgut band were contributing sweet harmony from a jungle of palms and greenery, exceedingly trying to the performers, for Hilda's bow hand was in danger of becoming entangled in a trail of smilax with every scherzo passage, while on the other side of the conductor's seat the leader of the first violins set in a bower of greenery, out of which her poor little face struggled vainly to see what she was playing. But the effect was very picturesque, and the hostess, a lady of some musical taste, was perfectly satisfied, so long as Mr. Julian Thorson did not draw his brows together with the expression of anguish that made conductors tremble when he audienced one of his own compositions. The whole affair put Hilda in mind of a ludicrous incident in Nicholas Nickleby, where the entire company in a provincial theatre recognize a London manager in the stage box, and immediately begin to direct all their energies at him. The hero made love at him, the heroine played her whole part at him. All the company neglected the exigencies of their positions, and spoke simply to him, in the midst of which it was discovered that the London manager was fast asleep. Hilda wondered whether Mr. Thorson would reward their efforts in the same way, for she was conscious that the entertainment was being run on something the same lines as Dickens' provincial theatre. The pieces chosen were those whose composers were known to be favourites of the great man, and the programme was abruptly altered in order that the cavatina might be introduced while he was still within hearing. With the corners of her mouth twitching, Hilda pushed aside a rampant fern in order that she might see what effect the last item, Sullivan's graceful dance, had had upon him. He was standing in profile to her, being talked to by his hostess, to whom he appeared to be gravely assenting at intervals, but hardly contributing to the conversation himself. There was rather a contemplative air about him, and she thought that perhaps he really had been listening to the Sullivan before his hostess began to speak. In spite of the first violin's warning, Hilda was not disappointed in her hero, for which rarest benefit of the gods she ought to have offered a special thanksgiving. Julian Thorson was a very tall man with square shoulders. His hair was grey and thick, and was long enough to wave without being unkempt, a great improvement on most of the male lions prowling around him. He wore an eyeglass on a black ribbon, with which he played as if the nervous trick were habitual to him, and for the rest he had a broad, generous forehead and deeply set eyes which held the loving kindness peculiar to short-sighted people. When he slowly turned towards the band, following some remark of his hostess, Hilda saw and liked the rather massive jaw and clean-shaven mouth. There was none of the sensuality usually to be discerned in the face of genius, but a great sensitiveness perhaps took its place, and made his contemplative regard of humanity somewhat paternal in its very gentleness. She judged him as a man nearer 60 than 50, and was quite satisfied to have it so. A minute later, the conductor rather impressively placed the cavatina on the stand, and began tapping round with the baton, as Hilda had too faithfully described his method of conducting. He frowned at the ladies of his band, who were still talking to each other under breath, rapped the music, and with an exaggerated gesture started the first soft notes of Mr. Thorson's melody. Hilda could not see how the composer received the compliment, for her severely perfect profile was turned to the audience while she drew her bow clear of the palms, and as she bent above her violin her whole soul became absorbed in the music, to the exclusion of any external distraction. Owing to the necessity of the band being seated, it was impossible for her to look down and distinguish anyone in particular among the muddle of faces and gowns and black coats grouped irregularly in front of the platform. Yet through it all she had a certain strange feeling that she was playing solely for Mr. Thorson, and a little thrill of excitement made her young body tingle. The cavatina's principal air was arranged with an unusual preference for the second violins, and Hilda at least threw her whole soul into it, playing her best for the quickening interest which possessed her. She was singularly unconscious for a beautiful woman, or rather she had grown so used to the impression she created that she seldom thought about it unless it was forced upon her notice. During the playing of the cavatina, certainly she never remembered that she was more evident to Julian Thorson than he was to her, nor did it strike her that as he stood facing the whole band it was most likely that his eyes would be attracted to her face amongst all the others, as mankind always does search for and dwell upon the most pleasing object within sight, though by a partially mechanical impulse. The last few bars of a really creditable performance were making the conductor swell with pride before Hilda Romaine turned her head and met the full kind gaze of the composer, experiencing a little shock of pleasure and surprise, for it was like meeting the eyes of a friend. "Could you tell me who is leading the second violins?" said Mr. Thorson quietly to his hostess. "I really don't know." She turned her program to the list of names. Miss Romaine, Miss Lyle, and Miss Thornton, second violins. "There, Mr. Thorson, you are as wise as I am. A very fair rendering, was it not? I hope the second violins did not spoil something to your finer ears. To me it sounded quite lovely, but I have no doubt it was full of faults to the composer." "Not at all, thank you," he said in the same quiet tone. "I have seldom heard it better rendered. I should like to thank the conductor." "Oh, certainly." But not only the conductor was called up, swelling with a satisfaction that might have suggested the cavatina to be his own rather than Mr. Thorson's, but the composer managed to speak a few words of courteous thanks to the ladies of the orchestra also, and in consequence they somehow felt themselves obliged to step down from the platform and receive his congratulation. He addressed them generally, it is true, but then he made a remark more particularly to the first violin, and left her forever converted to his worship, whether he were of Swedish birth or no, for he had a very charming manner, and then somehow he was standing next to the tall girl, whose name he had inquired, and turned quite naturally to speak to her also. "I am afraid you must be very tired by the end of the entertainment," he said gently. "Not more than other orchestras, I fancy." Hilda returned with a little low laugh that was half cynical. "We usually arrive with the ices and go away with the red cloth, but I am thankful to say I have never actually seen the red cloth laid, so there is something for which to be thankful." He looked at her with an intentness that she would have resented in 9 men out of 10. "And may I not get you some refreshment now?" he said easily, "if you have been playing for 3 or 4 hours." "Oh, no, thank you," she said hurriedly, shocked that her dry little speech should have resulted in this. "We shall go out and have some lemonade some time, I expect. There is generally one interval longer than the rest, during which the orchestra refreshes." He did not press the matter, but stood talking to the first violin and to Hilda herself in a desultory fashion, swinging his eyeglass on its black ribbon. And perhaps his notice had this much effect, that the hostess remembered the existence of the orchestra as human beings, and not mere machines, for soon after they were trooped off and regaled by themselves, as if they were in some sort social lepers, who might not mix with the rest of the guests. Hilda caught sight of Mr. Thorson at intervals throughout the night, now the centre of a group, now chatting to a single person who was important enough to engross his whole attention, and she always found his manner charming, even viewed at a distance. Once, also, towards the end of the performance, she met his eyes again, and they looked at each other with a kind of impersonal sympathy that made her feel as if she had gained a friend, though she never expected to do more than pass him in a crowd on some future occasion, perhaps not even that. Their second meeting was as unexpected as Magda's experience of her editor. Hilda was walking fast along Oxford Street a week or so later on her way home after a wearisome rehearsal, when she suddenly found herself in the centre of a street accident. There was a horse down, and the hope that someone was hurt had gathered the spectators so quickly and so fast that before she could push her way through, the girl felt herself jostled into the thick of it, and jammed against other foot passengers without being able to help herself. The gentleman next to her, pressed with her shoulder to shoulder, might be as anxious to proceed as herself, but for the moment neither could help the other, and looking round to apologize, Hilda found her eyes caught by a familiar face and a big grey head somewhere above her own. It was Julian Thorson, but she thought he was less likely to recognize her than she him. "I am so sorry that I can't move, but the stout lady behind me is butting me towards you, I think," she said gravely. "It is really not my fault that I am in your way," he began in the same breath, but waited for her sentence, and then laughed. As their eyes met, Hilda hesitated and said, "I think it is Mr. Thorson, and I know it is the second violin in the ladies' band who rendered my cavatina so perfectly," he said easily. "I was quicker at recognizing you than you were me, you see, though I never learned your name." Hilda smiled her wise little smile, holding her head back from its proximity to his shoulder, while the stout woman behind her prodded her way vigorously and forced them into each other's arms with embarrassing success. "What is your name?" said Mr. Thorson a little desperately at last, as she did not seem inclined to enlighten him. "Are you Miss Romaine, or Miss Lyle, or Miss Thornton?" "I am Hilda Romaine," said Hilda, and feeling the crowd loosen, set her shoulder to an opening and sidled through, while he followed as quickly as his bigger bulk would allow. "I want you to come into a tea shop and have tea with me," he said at once, as they mechanically fell into step along the pavement. "I cannot talk to you so well in the street, and I am very anxious to ask you some questions. It struck me that you had such complete mastery of your instrument the other night, that your talents are a little obscured in a ladies' band. Isn't that so? I am obliged to accept whatever position I can that will earn me my living, you see," said Hilda plainly. She was hesitating over the tea shop, but only from habit. Here was a man nearly as old as her father, a gentleman, one whose influence in musical circles must be enormous, and who could help her if he would. She looked at the deeply set dark eyes and spoke quietly. "If you are really interested, I will tell you anything I can about the position and remuneration in a ladies' band. Of course there are many grades, though I really believe that I have tried them all now. But I warn you that it will not be an exciting or exhilarating account. Rather depressing, I should think, by all I know and saw the other night," he amended, holding back the swing glass door of a tea shop for her to pass in. "This will do, won't it? There is a nice red plush corner for you, and all sorts of stale cakes. If I had only foreseen that I should meet you, I would have arranged for something better." He screwed the eyeglass into his eye, and regarded the entertainment offered with a silent distrust that said it was certainly not good enough for his guest. Hilda laughed her little satirical laugh as she took up the fare bill. Her eyes were lowered, but he saw the warmly tinted Greek face, and the bright well-groomed hair against the sordid red plush and gilding of the place. Behind Hilda a long mirror duplicated her, and offered another view of her bent head and sloping shoulders. Mr. Thorson was probably very short-sighted indeed, in spite of the eyeglass, to cause him to look at her so intently. It was a somewhat expurgated account of herself that Hilda gave him, because a certain decent reserve in her demanded that she should omit other people's agency in her circumstances. Whether or no he could silently supply the missing links, she did not ask herself. She only knew she was easing the bitter strain that had been running through her life for many years by this recounting of them to a sympathetic personality, which simply existed for her in two misty dark eyes. She talked to the eyes, the rest of the man being but a blurred outline to her, too vague to frighten her into reserve. For the time, indeed, he seemed to her sexless, but with a healing power in his voice to make her feel less of an outlaw against mere existence. Other customers came and went in the shop, and the waitress grew tired of commenting on the couple who lingered, talking so earnestly, and almost forgot them. It was long past 6 when Hilda rose to go home, having written her address for him in his pocket-book, and with no thought save that he might perhaps help her through it. They shook hands at the shop door, and the man stood bareheaded, with the glare of the electric light on his grey hair, while the girl sprang onto the step of a passing omnibus with the facility of a Londoner. Nous Autres rather pride themselves, as a rule, on being able to jump on and off without stopping the vehicle. Flare, for instance, would run and jump like a monkey, until told by her doctor that she positively must not, to her intense disgust. She had an unsound heart and weak muscles, but long training had taught her to calculate to a nicety how to dodge a passing cab, trot by the side of her omnibus, outpace the horses for an instant, and then spring for it. It saved time in the long run, and made her feel the equal of scornful man. Hilda's easy swing up onto the step of her conveyance, and the little backward curve of her body as she turned to smile at her late companion in the doorway, made her appear suddenly younger than while she talked of bitter things with a shadowed face. Her qualities of health and strength as well as beauty were startlingly apparent. Mr. Thorson looked as if someone had reminded him quite as suddenly that he was an elderly man, as he stood for an instant swinging the eyeglass on its black ribbon. They met in a desultory fashion 2 or 3 times after that, and talked over what might be done to improve her position before he began to write to her. It was then that she began to know and love the real man, for letters are the most dangerous attraction that can be offered a woman. The mere fact of his setting down his thoughts for her in black and white has a certain confidence and sacredness in it, and then a woman is nearly always an idealist, and would prefer to eliminate the flesh. There is no shock of physical awakening in a letter, and no sweet dread of touch. Even a lover's letters are suggestive of a man's mind rather than his body, and Thorson did not write as a lover. He was a charming correspondent, and far more accomplished in letter writing than Hilda, for alas, he had the drawback of his age to experience him. But he seemed quite satisfied with her replies, and no cloud darkened the serenity of their companionship for the first 3 months of the acquaintance. Then, on a day in spring, came a bolt from the blue, in the shape of a kindly, courteous letter, suggesting that he should call and see her in her home circle, and be made known to her father. Whether the expurgations in her accounts of herself had really deceived him, she could not tell, but it was the natural outcome of their growing intimacy that as a gentleman he should legitimize his pretensions to her friendship before her own people, instead of leaving it on the more unconventional footing on which it had hitherto stood. Hilda recognized the inevitable in Thorson's letter, and acknowledged that had he done otherwise he would have been a different man to the friend of whom she was growing really fond. But she knew also, as he could not, the household to which he asked so simply to be introduced. Mr. Romaine had a small house in the neighbourhood of Westbourne Park, where he lived a shabby life on a pension derived from having been in the civil service. He had retired early under a scare of heart disease, and had become the shambling figure of Hilda's knowledge of him, browbeaten by his wife, and slowly sinking lower and lower in the social scale. At one time, soon after his second marriage, they had launched into manifold expenses and hampered themselves with debts against which they still struggled, and as Hilda always saw the family in her mind's eye, it was a harassed, under-servanted life, with the long-legged stepsisters growing more and more common in manners and appearance, and taking the tone of the cheap schools to which they went in the neighbourhood. The mere look of the house was so impressed upon her that, to her dying day, she shuddered at its facsimiles in suburban districts, and they are many in London. It was a semi-detached villa, whose stucco front looked all the dirtier for the fact that its neighbour was rather rich in paint and hearthstone. Perhaps the tenant was more successful in bullying his landlord, for though Mr. Romaine also held his house on a repairing lease, he never seemed able to get anything done. There was a narrow flight of steps leading to the narrow front door, and before the house a neglected square of garden, which to Hilda suggested dilapidation and poverty far more than if it had not been so pretentious. and had looked sheer upon the street. The internal economy of the place matched the outside. For many years now they had had a succession of general servants, who were first overworked and then dismissed in a passion by their mistress, who being of much the same class as themselves, had all the arrogance of the beggar on horseback when set in authority over them. During the periods between the departure of one servant and the installation of another, Hilda did most of the housework, with set lips and the danger signal of her warm red blood rising to her face. Mrs. Romaine undertook the cooking, which she did to an accompaniment of loud grumbling, usually spoiling the food, and proclaiming herself as too exhausted to attempt such labour again. So the family lived on cold scraps and bread and cheese until the advent of a new domestic, to go through the same dreary curriculum of quarrels and dismissal, etc. But always, whether they had a servant or no, Hilda laid the meals, and made the beds, and risked spoiling her hands with washing up. It sounds perhaps a small price to pay for food and shelter, but after 10 years of such service, with endless bickerings, the most patient Griselda is liable to her moments of desperation, and the feelings that to clean her own boots and brush her own gowns is the one burden too much laid on her by fate. And it was to this household that Mr. Julian Thorson proposed being introduced, through his very usage, to the customs of the finer social world. Hilda thought of the great composer's grey head and the delightful charm of his manner in the hideous rooms where her stepmother's taste raged triumphantly in furniture and colouring. She thought of her father's nervous, shrinking efforts to talk, which had replaced his former natural ease, and of her stepsisters giggling and whispering in corners. Above all, of her stepmother's strident tones, and the chance of her being in an ill temper, in which case she would certainly be rude, just to show Hilda that it's no good being stuck up. I'm not going to cotton to her friends that she picks up in the street. Mrs. Romaine, having made her husband's acquaintance on an omnibus, had always been uneasily conscious of its irregularity, until she hit upon the plan of carrying the war into the enemy's country, and by constant assertion had really come to believe herself that Hilda's friends were never made but in the same way. Nevertheless, the girl knew that he must come, and with her lips set in an ugly line, she sat down and answered his letter, thanking him for the suggestion, and naming Sunday as the only day on which they were all sure to be at home. Perhaps she hoped in her heart that her stepmother might go to church, and leave her father and herself to talk to the guest, who, thank heaven, was at least not young enough to interest or attract Mrs. Romaine. The latter lady went to church for various reasons, as when she had a new gown to display to the shopkeepers in the neighbourhood who knew her, or when the girls had nice clothes, or when she was so hipped with staying at home that any change was better than none. She never, however, went without some such motive power to impel her there. Fate did not favour Hilda, or, if it did, it was by backhanded methods. Mr. Julian Thorson called on a day when every drawback was painfully in evidence, and when Hilda's surroundings were certainly at their worst. At least they formed a background to a very beautiful picture, for the girl sat with her hands resting one in the other on her knee, her face colourless and fine with suffering, and something rather grand in her quiescence throughout most of his visit. She introduced him to her father, stepmother, and stepsisters with a kind of grim amusement that had passed beyond humiliation, and Mr. Thorson had the full shock of his host's obvious uneasiness, as of a servant in the presence of his employer, of Mrs. Romaine's coarse, flushed assurance, and of Daisy's and Violet's startling resemblance to a young lady in a tobacconist's shop from whom he had chanced to buy some lucifer matches on his way. There were oleographs on the walls, and jingling bead curtains wherever they could be hung, and many photos of Mrs. Romaine's relations smirking at him out of gilt frames, and in the midst of it all sat Hilda, with her tortured Greek face, and the warm natural colours of her face and eyes, a triumphant contrast to Mrs. Romane's examples of artistic furnishing. Mr. Thorson looked at her desperate young beauty once, and drew a breath like a deep sigh. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Pathway of the Pioneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE. Chapter 12, Part 2. He had arrived at the house about 4 o'clock. After 20 minutes of discomfort, Mrs. Romaine turned to Hilda and suggested her getting tea in the tone of a bullying master to a dog. He guessed that she was showing off on his account, and winced for the first time, for Hilda could not assert herself now, and must accept the bragging order. She rose with perfect self-possession in her leisurely manner, and left the room, Mrs. Romaine adding in an offhand tone, "The girl's out, and we keep only one servant, Mr. Thorson. I suppose you think that a great hardship, but Mr. Romaine says he can't afford more. So, as I tell him, his daughter will have to play the slavey when the real one has a holiday. Hilda lays aside her fine airs when she's at home, I assure you. She has to if she wants her bed made and her boots blacked." She laughed loudly with a sense of triumph in destroying an impression of living at her ease, which she did not doubt that Hilda had tried to give. Why should she think otherwise, when she would most certainly have done so herself? Nor was there anything in the attentive face that Mr. Thorson turned on her to tell her what he thought of the revelation, unless the little trick he had of swinging an eyeglass on a black ribbon which he wore could be said to betray irritation. Mrs. Romaine put it down to affectation, however, and made a mock of what she called mollycalls for days afterwards. Only as Hilda entered the room again, with the tea-tray in her hands, he quietly swept some cheaply bound books from a small table, and made room for her to set it down. She smiled a little as she thanked him, the only time, he thought, throughout his whole visit. During the 35 minutes he spent in the vulgar little drawing-room, he learned many things, amongst others that Mrs. Romaine did not believe in people giving themselves airs, when half the world had never heard of them, by which she obviously meant that her knowledge of music did not include his work, being as a fact strictly limited to Dan Godfrey and Harry Hunter, and also that his acquaintance with Hilda was not favoured by the household, because they had not known him first, nor was he a young man of the very lower middle class behind a counter in the immediate neighbourhood. His grey hair and obvious middle age, indeed, made him somewhat of an anomaly to Mrs. Romaine, who felt herself balked of a good joke at least at Hilda's expense, to be increased by daisies and violets, facetious allusions to her young man. It was a little impossible to regard Mr. Thorson as a suitor, when he obviously made no pretensions to that position at all, and only referred to Hilda personally once, when, speaking directly to her father, he said that he considered Miss Romaine's talent worth something more than her present position, and hoped to help her to improve it. That he had not done so already was due to the fact that the man he most wished to see on the subject was in Germany, and he would not ask her to give up her band unless he could actually offer her a better engagement, with a prospect of its continuation. All this might be strictly satisfactory, but it was galling to a jealous, spiteful woman, who would rather have been able to pick holes in her stepdaughter than have to acknowledge her possible good fortune. Mrs. Romaine was no adept at keeping her annoyance to herself, and so by the time that Mr. Thorson left, she would barely shake with him, and was talking loudly and rather facetiously with her own daughters. her manner changing to offhand curtness as he made his adieu. It would hardly have improved her temper had she known that he did not notice her ill-breeding, because Hilda's hand as it lay in his for a moment had been stone cold, and her face was beginning to look drawn under the strain she was enduring. "You poor child, you poor beautiful thing, dropped like a rose in the gutter," he said to himself as he walked fast away from the dreadful house. "All day and every day, and nothing but that to come home to after hard work." He thought of his own ample means, of his luxurious house where every fastidious whim was studied, and in his kindly, humble heart he felt ashamed. "God preaches us roundabout sermons," he said with a sigh, slackening his pace after a while, and trying to calm his unusual excitement. That child's face was one. I wonder why he grinds the youth and beauty so out of his own creations. Such a life, dear heaven! A boy would have become vicious and gone to the deuce to console himself. The girl is enduring, as women do, and only growing dull and heartsick and embittered. Perhaps it seemed worse than it was, even, to his sensitive, over-refined nature, for he loved beauty passionately, and there was no beauty in Hilda's life, unless she made it for herself by her violin. Anyhow, he did not repeat the experiment of going to see her, but he asked her instead if he might introduce her to a lady, an old friend of his, and took her to a flat in Albert Gate, where this good angel lived. She proved to be an elderly woman, a widow, but with 40 years of married sweetness in her tired old face, and manners as ingratiating as Mr. Thorson's. Hilda wondered a little why she looked at her so long, and almost wistfully when they were introduced to each other, but she forgot to wonder in the pleasure given her by her hostess, and the atmosphere which surrounded her. Everything in this environment appealed to Hilda's taste, the refinement, the hint at luxury perhaps, which after all was only expressed by the girl's pitiful little desire to have things nice, and the society of a woman not only well educated, it would have been difficult to rival the soundness of Beatrice's actual education, or Magda's quick intelligence, but used to the daintiness of social life as well. Her name was Mrs. Mornington, and she seemed attracted by Hilda, whom she invited to come and see her whenever she liked. What Mr. Thorson had told her of her history, or how he had described her home circle from what he had seen of it, Hilda hardly dared to think, but once Mrs. Mornington said, "My dear, you are very, very pretty. It must be all the harder for you to face the world in earning your own living." And Hilda answered, "Yes, Mrs. Mornington, it is hard." And that was all, except that when they parted on that occasion the older woman put her hands on the girl's shoulders and kissed her. "Very, very pretty," she murmured to herself after Hilda had gone, "and quite a young woman." And then she took off her spectacles and wiped them, for they were dim. It is perhaps significant that Hilda never told Nous Autres of the extent of her intimacy with Mr. Thorson or Mrs. Mornington. They heard in the first instance of her meeting with him, and hoped that it might be of value to her from a purely material point of view. It was always useful in their experience to know influential people, but Hilda must have contrived, perhaps unintentionally, to mislead them into an impersonal view of Julian Thorson. Nor did they know of her constant visits to the flat in the Albert Hall mansions where Mrs. Mornington lived. From that bridge in her life, represented by her father's second marriage, the girl had gained a complete control of herself, with an unspeakable bitterness, whose only betrayal was the shadowed Greek face. But with the control, a little of the iron had inevitably entered into her soul, until she was as reserved, though in a stronger way, as Beatrice. Life was always teaching Hilda, and she learned hardly. Even the education of association with Mrs. Mornington and her flat was not all pleasure. It had its sore side in the feeling of being at a disadvantage, which beset her in the contrast between herself and other women whom she encountered there at times. Hilda made most of her own clothes with the same skilful fingers that managed her violin, but the most conscientious amateur's work is heart-rending in comparison to the paid professionals. She knew the value of her face and figure, but even in the evening, when toilet deficiencies seemed to her less noticeable in herself, she did not feel the clothed equal of the guests who listened to her violin playing with cordial pleasure, and rendered her the delicate homage of thanking her like a friend. What her audience saw for themselves on these occasions was a tall woman in a soft black gown, whose cut passed comment while it lent itself as an inoffensive frame for an attitude and face that made more than one sigh for faint envy. With her body swayed a little backwards as her firm, strong hand swept the bow to and fro, Hilda was a thing of curves and colouring, of splendid pure lines and the vital beauty of flesh and blood. Mrs. Mornington's room was a long one, overlooking the park, which lay like a map many stories below, and it was upholstered in a dull crimson that had the warmth of roses, and seemed to keep some eastern scent faintly hanging in the draperies. Against this kindly setting, Hilda's bright hair and blue eyes and flushed face were always set like a mosaic in Thorson's memory. They had known each other for 6 months of an intimate friendship before he fulfilled his promise of offering her a better position than the one she held in the ladies' catgut band. It was so natural to trust him, however, that the delay had hardly occurred to her as a fret at all. She knew that the great music publisher to whom he meant to speak about her was in Berlin. In the meantime she learned to play Julian Thorson's music to his own accompaniments, and to be happy without the cynical thread that had made even her laughter of a rather keen quality. Happiness had a developing effect upon Hilda, whereas the hard miseries of her life had threatened to condense her nature to a mere resisting force. There was something new in her face that made her beauty really noble, a hint of the maternal, a brooding glow that seemed to guard a secret too feminine for definition. It was with her on the day of Beatrice's breaking up party, and was the key to the feeling the younger girl tried to express when she said that she did not care to look at anyone else when Hilda was in the room. Something most tender was acting like a revelation in Hilda Romaine. She could afford to be gentle, and not to armour herself against the buffets which she had learned to expect from humanity. A subtle sympathy had made her understand Beatrice in her pain, and had left her with a quickened comprehension and anxiety when they parted that haunted her all the next day like a premonition. It chanced that she was going to the Albert Hall flat by Mrs. Mornington's invitation that evening, in spite of the increasing difficulties placed in her way at home, for Mrs. Romaine belonged to a class whose sense of authority consists in opposition. She did not really care whether Hilda had her own friends to visit or stayed at home, so long as her own diversions were not hindered. And Hilda became more scrupulous in discharging her barren duties in the household, the less love went with them, arranging matters carefully and with rigid justice so that she should be spared without inconvenience. Mrs. Romaine had nothing to complain of, therefore she grumbled in the hope of at least fretting her stepdaughter's temper to the destroying of any pleasure she might have had in going out, for she regarded Hilda's anger as her one vulnerable point, and since she knew in her undeveloped brain that she could not influence her in one least degree, she retaliated on the girl's impassivity by the petty revenges of studied ill nature. It was one of Hilda's worst afflictions that she had not even her bedroom to herself. More often than not it was shared by one of her stepsisters, whose upbringing and inherited instincts made personal niceties a minor consideration. So long as Daisy's frocks were sufficiently new and smart, she was not particular as to what lay underneath. Hilda's influence and example might have overweighted her stepmother's in this particular, if Mrs. Romaine had not regarded it as a point to be contested for the sake of victory. As it was, the torture of such close association was one which only a gentlewoman could appreciate, herded with a like companion. Hilda changed her gown to go to the mansions in a room made more intolerable by contrast to Mrs. Mornington's surroundings, because Daisy's personal belongings were littered about it, and by her mother's advice she had closed the windows to keep out the dust of the street. To do the child justice, she remembered the state in which she had left the room, and when her stepsister came in, tired after an afternoon performance of the ladies' band, she apologized hurriedly, and offered to run up and clear away some of my things. But Mrs. Romaine heard her, and promptly found a reason for her staying downstairs, through an almost mechanical habit of ill nature. Hilda came down again, ready to go out, with her lips set in the old line that meant unbroken silence, and left the house pelted by Mrs. Romaine's comments and taunts, which seemed to affect her as little as if she were one of her marble likenesses in the British Museum. But there was a red colour in her face that was not reflected by the sunset, and she swung along the road to the nearest station, and booked herself for Kensington High Street, with the same strained compression of her lips. This was the day, remember, of Beatrice's resignation, and was intensely hot even for July. Hilda got into a third-class carriage and threw her head up as if gasping for air, for the mental and physical sense of thunder in her atmosphere were almost more than she could bear. At Queen's Road, a gentleman came along the platform, evidently in search of a first-class carriage. He was a well-dressed man with a face that Hilda did not observe, for she was thinking of very different things, but her own seat was next the window, and her unconscious head turned towards the platform. The gentleman paused with his hand upon the door of the first-class carriage adjoining, looked at her, came back, and deliberately entered the third class. If she had been alive to her surroundings, Hilda would have been on her guard at once. But she did not even notice that anyone had sat down opposite to her. There was another woman at the further end of the carriage on the same side as herself. Otherwise, she and her vis-a-vis were alone. He sat well round in his corner, his legs elaborately crossed, his eyes fixed on the girl opposite with a glare like a beast of praise. When the train had started, he began to shift his position, bringing his knees slowly round until they touched hers. With a sudden sensation of physical sickness, Hilda became aware of his proximity, aware also that he belonged to a species of human animal that she had learned to know only too well, alas, and whose advances were always begun in this way in a public conveyance. Nous Autres early learned that this, their adversary, the bestial man, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. They warn each other after some unusually revolting episode, but they can afford to laugh scornfully at the insult cautiously offered to them. Hilda sat back and drew her knees away. She did not look at the man, in the hope that her action was sufficient rebuff. He moved his feet and touched her again, pressing her until she drew her knees back against the door of the carriage. Then he jammed his own against them, his eyes never moving from their scorching stare. Hilda waited, drawing her breath. All the anger that her stepmother had roused, and she had held in check, flared up now at his augmentation of her passion, as a spark applied to a train of gunpowder. The blood surged over her beautiful face, making it the mask of an angry goddess, and her eyes were two gems of living sapphire. As she turned them on him at last, and, leaning forward, spoke so distinctly that the other woman heard and turned her head, gaping with surprise. "Will you be good enough to move your knees from against mine?" It is not often that Lothario hears his methods clearly stated in words, for he counts on the fact that womanly decency shrinks from acknowledging any knowledge of them. The gentleman stared still for a moment, as if petrified, then he stammered something, raised his hat, and as the train drew into the next station he stumbled out onto the platform almost before it was safe. Hilda leaned back in her seat serenely. Only the stormy rise and fall of her breast betrayed the boundless rage which was out of her control for the minute. She was so passionately angry that it shook her, even as the incident itself had not done, and her heart was still beating unevenly when, after taking off her hat under the auspices of Mrs. Mornington's maid, she was shown into the long familiar room in the mansions, with its red draperies and faint smell of eastern spices. Mrs. Mornington was not present, and the servant asked Hilda to excuse her for a few minutes. She was writing letters. Rather glad to have time to compose herself, Hilda replied that Mrs. Mornington was not to hurry on her account, and took up an illustrated paper to distract herself rather than with any idea of amusement. The quiet, luxurious peace of the room, and its subtle scent, acted like balm on her wounded mind, and she drew a long sigh of pleasure and relaxation, as one who rests after long pain. After a few minutes, she dropped the paper and moved leisurely to the looking-glass. Mrs. Mornington had not appeared yet, and she stood still before the glass, studying herself, and mechanically touching her gown into still more conventional order. No woman could have been quite without satisfaction in the reflection that a mirror gave to Hilda, however lamentable the garments she might be wearing. But Hilda was really not thinking of the mere colouring of her splendid young flesh and blood, or of praising the old black gown that at least had the merit of being soft and not obtruding its material upon her already complete beauty. To dress Hilda in a costume that drew attention from herself to itself would have been as bad as to bundle up the Venus de Milo in a kimono. The girl's eyes were turned inward, however, trying to see herself as the gentleman of the train had seen her, and her fine brown eyebrows came together with the ugly effort. To this man, who might be typical of a score of others, she had been but a pretty face and finely developed figure, travelling third class, for which reason she was certainly approachable, and possibly obtainable, whence followed the natural advances of the male animal to the female. It was all so sordid and repulsive, even to remember, that her face became set like an avenging Juno, and she felt herself somehow defiled by the possibility of such things shaping themselves in men's brains, brought there perhaps by her own innocent existence. She was still standing facing her reflection, a girl with the mask of outraged deity, who was putting herself conventionally to rights before a French mirror, when the door opened and Mr. Thorson came into the room. She turned at once to shake hands with him, but her smile was a little less candid and a little more suspicious than usual, for the stain of Nous Autres was upon her, and she had been reminded back into her watch upon mankind. It was not a generous mood in which to greet anybody, not a fair one in which to judge a friend. "Mrs. Mornington has asked me to come and talk to you while she finishes her letters," he said, as simply as usual. She noticed that he was in evening dress, and wondered a little. He did not always dress when he dropped in to see his old friend in the evenings, a velvet coat being allowable unless there were other guests. It had made these less important evenings more sociable, and Hilda had liked it. Now, however, there seemed a certain convention added by his very correctness of costume. He looked almost handsome, certainly picturesque, and with a sudden revulsion of feeling she recognized him as a masculine personality, desirable to women for something else than his genius. Even the eyeglass on its black ribbon was more noticeable against his white shirt-front, and seemed characteristic of a leisure class set apart from the workers to whom she belonged. "I am glad to be able to have a little talk with you," he went on, not with any more stiffness, but in a subtly confidential tone that made what he had to say more serious. "I want to talk to you about your future." "Yes?" said Hilda. "The man I told you about, my publisher, is back, and I saw him yesterday. We both thought that it was no use to ask you to give up the certainty of what you are doing unless we could offer you an equal certainty, but with better prospects." "No," Hilda spoke as earnestly as he had, and her manner was the honest one of a person who sees a necessity and bows to it. I cannot take anything uncertain, however advantageous it might look in the future. I feel bound to help my father as long as I live at home, and I should like to be able to help him even if I lived away." For a moment she paused, looking at that possible life, a life free from the hideousness of her present one, which she could yet feel to be her right, and her eyes deepened in colour as they always did, with pleasure, fancied or real. She was standing with her hands resting on the mantel-shelf, her figure bending a little without stooping. Her head drooped in the old graceful way from the neck. Thorson had seen her in innumerable attitudes, but he never remembered her ungraceful, nor did he ever feel tired of that inevitable poise of the head. "And so," he went on, as if taking up her words, while he still stood and looked at her, "we talked you over and came to the conclusion that you ought to get plenty of concert engagements after a while, with his and my influence to back you, but concert work being even at its best uncertain, we thought that at the same time you should try teaching, for which it seems to me that you are far more fitted than most, because you are very painstaking and absolutely thorough." She flushed a little, whether at the praise or for some other cause could not be guessed. Hilda flushed when she was resentful as much as when she was touched. "I should have tried pupils, but I could not get any," she said with a touch of the old mockery at herself. "I do not mean private teaching. Our view was that you should pass certain examinations, and hold certificates from some conservatoire. I assure you, you would not find it the impossible thing you imagine, and then become a supplementary teacher there. Of course, in all these places there are certain men who have made their names, and who command their fixed amount of guineas for a lesson, according to scale. But to my mind some of the best work, all the grounding which I think so important, is often done by those whose names merely appear on the prospectus and are hardly noticed, except by those who know. There are some schools of music where both my man and I have influence, and where the teachers do not all have to hold certificates for playing scales at Vienna. At least I would guarantee that it should be a post on which you could depend for a living, without killing yourself with work, and whereby you could help your people without living at home. What do you say?" "I should be only too thankful," said Hilda, a little breathlessly. "Very well. Now the only thing is that at present we have not exactly the post we want falling due, but we think we shall have in a short time. In the meanwhile," he looked a little curiously at her, she thought, as if he considered her afresh almost from a stranger's point of view, "I have another alternative to suggest to you." She did not foresee what was coming, and yet by some subconscious intuition she moved away from him, her face losing its glow of grateful colour, and her blue eyes seeing not him but the man in the train. "It is not the sort of alternative one offers to a woman without some hesitation," he went on, in a tone that had suddenly become hurried and lowered. "A man of my age must be much tempted before he would make such a proposal. Tempted beyond his power to resist, and past his own judgment too, perhaps. Hilda, can't you see what I am offering you? I pose oddly as a lover, dear little girl. I suppose you have grown so used to think of me as the composer, the person with influence to help you, that as a man you have not thought of me at all. It seems nearly as odd to me as to you, to ask you, who are not much more than half my age, if that, to let me love you and protect you. It is not a very tempting offer, is it? A grey head and a bachelor flat." All this time she had not spoken, but she had gradually turned to face him, the horror of the whole thing forcing itself upon her shuddering, reluctant mind. It required a real effort to prevent herself from putting her hands up to her ears to shut out the sound of his familiar musical voice, which had only spoken honestly and kindly to her until now, when he used it to degrade her ideal of him. In one vivid flash of intuition, it seemed to her that the whole world was corrupted for her, turned from a friendly humanity into universal devilish enmity. Her suspicions rained in on her mind like frozen hail. Why had Mrs. Mornington stayed out of the room and left her to this? Why, if she were not in the plot? Why was there no one else to be present tonight? Had they all stood aloof, these pleasant, smiling men and women who had spoken to her softly and seemed to wish her well, while, no doubt, they had every one foreseen this end, perhaps thought that it had come already? No doubt, no doubt. She was one of Nous Autres, an outsider debarred from men's honesty or woman's equality. The red tide rose to the armpits, and the struggle to live was death. With the red tide risen in her heart, Hilda faced him, her hand against every man's from henceforth, every man's hand against hers. She was frantic with her delayed passion, the passion roused by her stepmother and the man in the train, and with the disappointment of the moment. With newly crimsoned cheeks and eyes made beautiful by her scorn, she turned upon him like a warrior woman, her words fighting for her sex, her voice pitched 2 notes lower than usual in her excitement. "How dare you?" she said savagely. "How dare you even offer me such a position as that you hint to me? You are ashamed to speak out with good cause. What have I ever done that you should think me worthy of an insult you would not dare to offer to a woman of your own standing? What in your experience of me has justified you in rating me so low? I thank you for your offer. It has degraded you as it could not do me. You can take your answer from that. I am the stuff of which men's wives are made, Mr. Thorson, not their mistresses." For a minute he remained looking at her blankly, as if the storm of her words bewildered him into not understanding them. Then suddenly he made a deliberate step towards her instead of drawing back as she expected, and took and held her in his arms with a strength and tenacity that even her fury could not resist. "Hilda," said the kindly voice she knew, with patient tenderness, "my poor child, how you must have suffered, not to know even when a man is honest. My dear, do you think I could love you and wish to make you anything less than my wife? It was my fault for putting it so stupidly." The voice went on whispering, soothing her quivering nerves as skillfully as a great physician might a patient. "See how a man blunders over his first proposal. I'm too old, Am I too old, Hilda?" She did not answer in words, but she shook the tears out of her blue eyes, and left them more than ever like wet violets to look up at him. There was no apology for her. Her life had been excuse enough in its exposure to men's license. Let him be ashamed of his sex if he would, before he cried shame on the woman. He stood holding her, more tenderly than with passion, as if she were something that had been very badly hurt, and which, maybe, only the angels could really heal. And below the concern of his grave man's face, her brown head lay on his breast in an abandonment of grief and rest that told of a reaction more utter than he could realize, while her hands clung to his shoulders in the attitude of one drowning who holds to a last hope of succor. The room smelt more of Eastern spices than ever tonight, and of fresh English roses. Perhaps Mrs. Mornington, who lingered still over her letters, had placed the great bowls of flowers purposely about the place, to make it always sweet to the memory of those 2 friends of hers, whom she had been wisely watching and helping for months. Hilda sat down on the broad Persian divan, where all the cushions were collected, and Thorson sat beside her with her hands in his, and looked in her face as if he found an inspiration there, such as set his own music singing. It was so quiet that Hilda heard the rustle of her gown as she turned a little towards him, and there was a silence upon them, as if their happiness were so new and delicate that they might almost scare it away with words. "And when will you marry me, dear?" he said under his breath at last, and the mixture of anxiety and reverence in the tone made her a queen bestowing favours. "There is nothing to wait for, is there? And I am not so young I can afford to squander my time with you." "You are trying to frighten me with a bogey of old age," she half whispered back. "I know of nothing to wait for except the wedding cake. The irresistible laughter came back to her eyes, and the shadow of bitter experience seemed lifted from her face, at least for the moment. A month. Yes, surely a month is long enough for all the necessary paraphernalia. Will you come to Italy with me, my beauty? I have never been abroad, said Hilda slowly. Visions of Venice, of far-off snows, of all the wonder of the world came to her, and she had a breathless sense of what all this meant. Yet even in that moment, following hard upon the delirious prospect of sharing in the joys of this earth, which has seemed set far beyond her horizon, there came the half-whimsical relief that petty worries would be amongst the things that were past, and her actual thought was, I shall not have to clean my own shoes, or lay my meals when I am tired, any more. The education of her life had taught her the drawbacks of such small pinpricks, but it had taught her also the value of the best things he had lain at her feet. And she turned to him with a gracious, instinctive movement and laid her cool, bare arm across his shoulders. I am by nature a hard woman, I think, Julian, she said simply, and perhaps if I had been happier, I should have been so wrapped up in myself that I should have grown selfish. You see, I have almost perfect health, and when one's body does not prick one with reminders of the fact that there is pain to bear in the world, one's brain is apt to forget it. I have gone through a great deal of life education, more than I shall ever tell you, I hope, but it has at last made me realize the full value of what you have offered me. Please love me, the rest may go past. We have proved that much even with regard to each other, Nous Autres. For the minute the pressure of his arms round her was his only assurance. But as he looked into the blue eyes that were almost stern with remembered knowledge, he said, I want to know your friends, dear. You will let me, won't you? Alma and Magda, whose sketches I know already under her initials, and Frank, and the others of whom you have told me. I will introduce you to them with pleasure, but you must not expect them to accept you as one of themselves, she said rather slowly, as if she had some difficulty in explaining her meaning. You must remember that their very lack of success makes them fence themselves round with a barrier. You will find that they receive you with what seems to you perfect frankness, and in that very frankness lies their reserve. I belong to a class that is no class, whom we call Nous Autres, because there is no accepted position or status for them yet, and they are the most difficult of all people to help. Because they need help most? Because, how can I put it, they are outlawed by their own independence, or perhaps because they are merely a passing phase, making the way for a younger generation who will have the fair dealing and the acknowledgment for which Nous Autres have fought. I sometimes think that no one can help Nous Autres except Nous Autres. It makes one feel very impotent for oneself, Hilda. I am afraid you are, and yet I don't know. I will do my best, and perhaps Alma and Frank will be honest with you. Her thoughts went back rapidly to the discussion of the night before, the going out of one's sphere, which they had nearly all condemned. Magda Burke will like to know you, I think, but Flair, the writer whom the press calls Flair Caldecott, will drop me when I marry you, said Hilda with conviction. Not for any personal reason, but because she drifts with her circumstances. The one of them all whom I think you could help is Beatrice. Is that the girl whose voice you said might be cultivated? Yes. She is in uncongenial surroundings, doing work that is too hard for her. And, I don't know, I think there is a private trouble that might be more bearable if there were something better in her life. We will certainly help Beatrice, said Julian Thorson cordially, but they neither of them knew that by that hour Beatrice had already helped herself. In her new-found happiness Hilda glowed and was glad. She was always grateful to her providence that her romance came graciously with nothing sordid to spoil it, but only the memory of rose-red rooms and a great tenderness. Had Thorson been a younger man even, she felt that it would have been less perfect, for the very strength and vitality of youth makes cruder demands, and the years behind her had taken something from her of the capacity to meet young love on equal ground. She had above all things a sense of rest in the marriage offered her, and dimly realized that, with all her unusual health and splendid physique, she had grown tired. They were friends and companions before they became lovers. She looked into the quiet promise of his eyes and accepted protection with a relief that was like grateful prayer. "What is she thinking of?" said Thorson at last, as her eyes came back from their long gaze past the red glow of the room into other scenes where he could not follow even in memory. "I was thinking of how glad I am that I was strong enough to wait," she said. "Some of us grew too tired, and some of us despaired." She thought of Winnie's laughter, that had seemed tragic later on. "And some of us waited in vain, perhaps. But I have been so fortunate. I feel almost superstitious about it, and afraid to say it is real, lest I should wake up and find it is a dream. For after all, I am one of Nous Autres, and this belongs to the real girls." "When a man falls in love, it is always with the real girl," he answered. "It makes her a real girl, to him at least. Don't you see?" "I fear," said Hilda, with her quick, low laugh, extricating herself from his arms to meet the leisurely rustle of an approaching gown. "Hush, here is Mrs. Mornington at last. We must behave ourselves." But she knew, even as she went forward to meet her hostess' warm, silent kiss of congratulation, that by that very acknowledgment she passed into her kingdom and was no more of Nous Autres. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Pathway of the Pioneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE. Chapter 13. Friends, old friends, and what if it ends? Shall we dare to shirk what we live to learn? It has done its work, it has served its turn, and forgive or forget, or hanker and fret, we can be no more as we were before. If it ends, it ends, with friends. W. E. Henley. "We dwindle in numbers," said Flare. "But the tide is surely turning," said Frank cheerfully. "For some of us," added Magda quietly. Her friend Deb had come down to fill Beatrice's place, and B.A. was there to take Alma's. But Winnie was gone also, and Hilda had announced her engagement. And through their sincere congratulations fell the shadow of goodbye. There was not one of them that wished it otherwise, but there was not one who did not know that Hilda must take up her new life and drift apart from them. They had lost their god of the sun, the Apollo Belvedere, and the grave beauty of the Greek face would look from another setting, a better one, they knew. They were not on the whole a lugubrious community, but when one is always disheartened and generally disappointed, it comes hard to be cheerful, even over another's gain which means one's own loss. It is possible to be content with very little. Nous Autres are proving it every day. But the theory of divine patience supposes an inevitable crown as a reward. Show me the religion that says, "Be good for the love of good," and does not throw in heaven as a bribe. Christ himself, Buddha himself, may have said it, but perhaps because the priests have narrowed the wide ground plan of religion to rules and dogmas, they have always been forced to hold out an ultimate gain to get their flock into the fold. Nous Autres do not as a rule believe in dogma. They are not, as has been seen, very religious. They generally do their needlework on Sunday, a shameful thing to all good churchwomen, who would rather be slovenly and dirty than use a needle and thread on the Sabbath, because they had not time during the 6 days that God might have decreed them work. And they do not think that by saying long prayers they will attain heaven, their experience of earth rather leading them to doubt the existence of such a place. Nevertheless, they do believe in its essential essence, and they go straight for the blind faith that is in them, and that finds expression in some ideal, such as Hilda found in her traditions, Frank in her mother, Alma because being of God she loved God, the real one, not the exclusive property of sex. Beatrice in her self-respect. Flare because, as she said, she couldn't be a cad. There is no hope of reward in this world or the next to urge them. Sometimes they slip and fall. Sometimes, like Winnie, they are driven mad and reckless. Or like Beatrice, they tender their resignation. But in the main they fight a good fight, and when they finish their course they have kept the faith. When one of them touches the hope of happiness, as Hilda had done, they rejoice the more in that they have known none such themselves. But it is hard to lose a comrade, and their feeling found expression in Magda's voice as she answered Frank. The tide is turning, for some of us. I had a letter from Alma today, said Flare, and perhaps she introduced the subject with intention. She is really in luck at last. She was understudying a character part, and the woman who had it fell ill, and Alma played it. The original actress has had to go home, and Alma is not only to play it through the tour, but is to be in their next London production. Flare never embroidered news on fiction lines. She gave it succinctly as a journalist, but it made its effect. "Hurrah!" Frank exclaimed. "Dear old girl, I am glad. B.A., give me a glass of neat claret on the strength of that. We'll all drink her health, standing up. Get up, Hilda. Yours will come next." "Here, don't dig me in the ribs, Frank, or send me on to the floor in your enthusiasm," Hilda retorted, beginning to laugh and nearly choking over her glass in consequence. "Propose the toast, somebody. I am going to start, for she's a jolly good fellow." "Here's Alma Craik, and her continued success," said Frank. Somehow it seemed Frank's lot in life to start the cheering for those who were luckier than herself, or as she herself said, she was born to play accompaniments. Just as she had given the note for the national anthem in the extension, so now she began the hip hip hurrah, with such good effect that R.L. looked as if he wanted to put his paws over his ears or stuff them with his tail. "Hip, hip, hurrah!" rang the voices to the accompaniment of clinked glasses. And then, "For she's a jolly good fellow," sang Frank. They could all sing except B.A., and she refilled the glasses. "For she's a jolly good fellow, for she's a jolly good fellow, and so say all of us. And now, ladies, another toast," said Frank, before they subsided. "I call upon you to drink the health of Hilda Romaine, one of ourselves, Nous Autres, and to wish her health, wealth, and happiness. We think, don't we, that she is fortunate in marrying a man like Julian Thorson, not only because he is a successful man, but because everyone knows that he is a gentleman, and a good one. But we think also, don't we, girls," and Frank's voice rang, "that Julian Thorson is more to be congratulated on marrying our Hilda, and we speak from what we know and have proved of her. Salut, Nous Autres, hip hip." The last echo of the final shout made several people in Duncannon Street pause, under the impression that a school treat must be going on in the unlikely precincts of the little side-turning, and they would have been quite incredulous had they been informed that the noise was due to 6 girls. Then Frank started the chorus again, and they sang it standing until they were hoarse, and dropped exhausted into their seats, whereupon Hilda patted Frank on the head by mean advantage of her inches, and R.L., still suspicious of their sanity, jumped for Flare's knee and prodded her. Nobody but B.A. and Magda, as it chanced, were smoking tonight. The rest of the society had been forced to bring some work with them, as occasionally happened when the hours had been long in office or theatre, and the Woman's Day had got pushed on one side, for they keep the Sabbath to rest in when they can. Flare was trimming a hat, and doing it very badly. She usually left this sort of thing to Alma, who was a born milliner, but Alma being away, Flare's appearance suffered. Hilda was mending gloves, and not remembering for a minute that she would not have to do it in the future. Deb was tatting embroidery to trim underlinen, and Frank was darning stockings with great industry. "If I don't get a pair done tonight, I shall have to go to the office with a hole in my heel tomorrow," she said with a chuckle. "Go on, Flare. Tell us more of Alma's letter." "She was rather funny about her landlady. You know what theatrical landladies are. It appears that the company arrived at this last place at 6 in the morning, and Alma was so fagged when she had found her digs that she just lay down on the sofa while her breakfast was prepared and smoked a cigarette. She noticed that the landlady was casting suspicious glances at her, so at last she spoke. 'Well, Mrs. Jones,' she said, 'you look very surprised. Haven't you ever seen an actress smoke before? You have had plenty here.' 'No, miss,' said the landlady gloomily. 'No, they didn't smoke, but they did everything else,' she added. Alma said she never heard anything so suggestively inclusive. Everyone laughed, perhaps because they were determined to be in good spirits, perhaps because Flare told her tale with a certain dry humour. She was frowning and sighing over the tortured hat on her knee the next moment, and ended by trying it on R.L., who twitched a vexed ear and turned round the other way. "Hang the brute! The hat, not R.L. "It won't come right," said Flare. "Besides, I can't see. Frank, just light the gas a minute. There's a good fellow." Frank did as she was requested, and saw something besides the mangled hat. "Flare, you are looking very seedy," she said decidedly. "When are you going for a holiday?" "Oh, next month. Any time," said Flare absently, tying a nasty tight bow of ribbon and putting it at a most unbecoming angle. "When I've got this hat finished, perhaps. Besides, I've had my holiday really, for I went away with Alma in May. It's only the heat that makes me limp. 90 in the shade this week. The underground has been like Hades. What a pity you have to go on it." Frank looked a trifle anxiously at Flare. "Sometimes it seems to me wicked that women should be born delicate when they have to work. We ought all to have been made of cast iron." "Yes, but our parents very seldom realized the duty that they owed to the next generation," said Deb shrewdly. "We are all pledged to the future, and ought to be taught to acknowledge the debt from the first. Every woman who marries should have to pass a medical examination, if I had my way. And if she put on false airs of shame, more shame to her." Deb was almost as tall as Hilda, and made on a much larger scale. She impressed her hearers with a sense of one having authority, and she looked big enough to take all Nous Autres into her capacious heart. There was, indeed, something maternal about her that made Flare snuggle up to her at times, and Magda rest her head against her knee when she came home tired. Flare depended on B.A. for strength when she needed support, Alma for sympathy, and Deb to mother her on the rarest of occasions. She admired Magda, had sympathized with Beatrice, and loved Winnie, while Hilda and Frank stood to her for all the virtues. Her point of view is valuable as somewhat sampling that of the other girls. "That is Ruskin's view," said Magda. "I always thought it very sane, and not at all impossible. And as to scaring anyone off marriage, it couldn't do that more than most women are scared by the little they know." "That seems to me taking an exaggerated view of a small detail," said Flare with brutal plainness. "The real gravity of marriage consists in the little things of everyday life, and whether one can be satisfied oneself and make one's companion satisfied, much more than in the bogey which women make out of certain functions of nature. They are a shock, I admit, when you first learn of them, but they are such a very, very small detail compared with ordering the dinner and knowing a little about the money article, just enough to listen intelligently." Magda's mouth was mutinous, but she did not follow a dangerous subject. She had her own opinions, and Flare was shamelessly outspoken, if pressed. Instead of risking anything more outrageous, she coolly seized on Flare's notebook, a dear possession, and never far from its owner, and turning the pages took her fountain pen out of its leather case. "What are you doing, or going to do?" demanded Flare, making a feeble grab at her property, and failing signally in her effort to regain it. "I am not going to read the poetry, with which I see that this is filled in horrible, disjointed lines," said Magda, as she laid her half-smoked cigarette on the ash-tray with thrifty care. "But the spirit moves me to draw Hilda at this particular crisis in her existence, and I have too much respect for my own gowns to carry a notebook wantonly. When I must have a bulging pocket, I must, but I don't live in expectation of being taken ill with an inspiration, as you apparently do." "Well, I don't carry letters from the last man who has asked me to tea or luncheon as you have to do daily, lest you forget," retorted Flare. "Half a dozen love letters must ruin the set of your gowns quite as much as my innocent notebook. However, I forgive you if you will make us a good likeness of Hilda. Get to work, April." Hilda obligingly turned her face in the position that Magda wanted, and B.A. offered the artist a pencil. But Magda declined and began to sketch with her fountain pen on a sheet of Flare's scribbled book, where burdens for ballads were hopelessly mixed with faint imitations of Rossetti and Lindsay Gordon, and half a line would mean as much as a shorthand note to Flare, and get worked up sometime into topical verses. Like all true artists, Magda thought in her own medium, and the most natural expression of her art, for her, was in line. She drew with a sure and certain touch for some silent minutes, and then handed the result to Flare. It was as successful a sketch as any she had ever made, pure and bold in outline, characteristic of Hilda, a simple expression of Magda's thought of her friend. "Ah, how good!" Flare exclaimed in honest delight. "And you have kept the look of the Apollo Belvedere. Hilda, you must certainly have a son, and he must be just like the statue." "And do please arrange for him to be 6 feet high," put in Deb comically. "I see so many undersized things in the city that I begin to wonder if there are any men left in existence." Magda looked at Hilda with raised brows as her sketch was passed round and admired. "I hope you are taking all this in, Apollo," she said dryly. "We are giving you due notice of our wishes beforehand, you see. Indeed, our whole very questionable conversation tonight is solely for your benefit, and inspired by your startling news, which has demoralized us." "Yes, Hilda, and for goodness sake, don't let any mistaken ideas of modesty stop you from knowing what to do for your children," said Frank earnestly. "Our mothers thought it womanly to ignore the question, so that they ran risks of which we are the shining examples and results. We may be immodest and coarse in our generation, but at least let us have nothing to answer for in the way of feeble constitutions and the germs of disease." She glanced instinctively at Flare's flaccid white face bent over the hat. "Of all Nous Autres, you are the most fit to be a mother. Pay the debt owed to us, to the next generation, and if it should happen, which God forbid, that a daughter of yours should be one of Nous Autres, let her come to the struggle at least well equipped with a sound body and a healthy mind." "Hear, hear," said Magda. "You are not offended, are you, Hilda?" "Not at all, though I think you need not be so previous with my nursery," said Hilda, with a little irrepressible laugh. "I know what you mean, Frank, and I have more theories, if anything, than you have. Marriage is, after all, a woman's most natural and greatest work, not the accomplishing of the mere marriage ceremony, but all that comes afterwards in daily life. It means the giving of one's whole energies to it to make a success." "I am with you there," said Flare, without raising her eyes from her work. "If I married, I should give up trying to write. I don't believe in serving two masters." "I wish you were happily married, Flare, though it would mean goodbye to literature for you. They say no really happy woman writes a book, or for that matter does anything else to absorb and distract her mind. But it would, I am sure, be an immense gain in some ways to you. It is a more correct lens through which to focus things in the world generally than the one by which you see." Flare laughed shortly. "You wish I were married?" she said slowly. "I? How about health and heredity, Hilda, and the next generation? No, we suffer for the faults of someone behind us, but at least we need not let our children have to say the same thing. There is only one honest course for the victims of heredity to take, and that is not to aid in the wrong from which they have themselves suffered. We condemn our parents, then let us be consistent, and not repeat the mistakes we have discovered. There is not much that we can do in this world, perhaps, but at least we can abstain from doing. Hilda was rather blankly silent. Her troubled eyes rested on Flare's rumpled head, and the curious blue shade round her mouth and eyes, and she was too honest to say that she thought Flare had anything desirable to bequeath to another generation. Even her brains were a thought morbid and ill-balanced, the natural outcome of an ailing body, perhaps. She was no darling of nature, but she was the implacable example of many an outraged law, and served the living sermon, preached without intention by poor humanity. The result of Hilda's scrutiny was that she spoke rather irrelevantly, and certainly abruptly. "Flare, I wish you would go and see your doctor. You can't afford to play tricks." "All right," said Flare, with an easy little laugh. "I knew that was coming. The poor man will tell me to avoid stairs, and to do my writing lying down on my back. He always does." "Is there anything really the matter with you, Flare?" B.A. asked kindly. She was shrewdly accustomed to calculate the strain of minds upon bodies, and to judge just how much the mechanism would stand, and did not over-gear her pupils any more than she did her bicycle. "Nothing new," said Flare composedly. "I have a weak constitution, and in consequence a weak circulation and a weakened heart. It would be affectation to say I was sound anywhere, but I have no cause for alarm. I don't suffer any pain unless I do silly things, and then I have a sharp attack that teaches me wisdom." "Attack of what?" said Magda resentfully. She had the energy to combat definite ills, and she hated an unseen adversary. "I am sure I don't know," said Flare, yawning. "It's about as sharp as cramp, and it comes on pretty quick. If it went on long, I expect you'd die of sheer pain, but it never does go on. Talk of something else, please." "The future of the nation seems laid on its women, first and last," remarked Frank, scrambling out of her chair. "Who goes home? Don't get up, Flare. R.L. looks so comfortable." "You can let yourselves out tonight," said Flare. "I am posing as an invalid on Hilda's suggestion." "We do not want any more gaps in the circle," said Hilda quietly. It was the only direct reference made to Beatrice that night. Nous Autres are not given to wailing, and they had said directly to each other as they chanced to meet all that was to be said. "The tide is turning," said Frank hopefully. "We have done with all the saddest parts, Hilda, and now we shall begin to look forward. You are our beacon star. Your wedding is to be our new starting point." Hilda smiled her grave smile. There was little alteration as yet in the noble beauty of her face, unless it were for a softer colour in her eyes, and a gentler setting of her lips. But she would always be rather grave than gay. "I want to bring Mr. Thorson to introduce to you all," she said. "Or if you like it better, you can come and meet him somewhere. But you must all know him." "All that were left of them. Left of 600, hummed B.A. "Don't croak," said Frank, pounding her on the back with an excellent intention of improving her spirits. "I want Alma here to back me up, and uphold my theory that the tide is turning." "You have said that before," said Magda teasingly. "Repetition of a phrase is one of the first things to eliminate in composition, and if you insist on being so optimistic, I shall back Flare's pessimism. We dwindle in numbers." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Pathway of the Pioneer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE. Chapter 14. Take no thought for us. The blood of the forerunners is like the seed which the wise husbandman scatters on the fertile ground. Mrs. Humphrey Ward. So the gods lost Flare. The driving of Flare. There, take that to your chemist and have it made up. And keep it about you. Don't leave it at home when you are going out reporting, mind. Flare's doctor smiled as he got out of his chair to open the door for her, but there was something behind the smile, an anxiety, a rapid calculation in his long experienced mind. Should he tell her more? Should he warn her as seriously as he could? He had seen enough of Flare to know that if he paralyzed her nerve, he should do exactly the thing he was trying to prevent, hasten her to a crisis that might lie many years ahead. He reached the door first and stood with his hand on it, looking at her. "I suppose there is nothing more to be done?" said Flare carelessly, "except to take ordinary care. Don't overtire, and don't rush up and down stairs. What are you smiling at?" "Well, you see, it doesn't lie in my hands exactly. If I have to be on a report for 6 hours, say, and a meal snatched anyhow, well, I've got to do it. I'm sorry to have given you all this trouble over me, but I promised a friend of mine that I would ask you, and to tell the truth, I thought you might give me something to stop the pain. I hate and fear pain," said Flare candidly. "That prescription that I have given you will stop the pain. That is why I don't want you to be without it," said the doctor. "Take it at once when you feel the attack coming on, and don't take a 6 hours report if you can possibly avoid it." He met the gentle irony in Flare's eyes, and his earnestness deepened. "Miss Caldecott, you absolutely must be careful. If you don't, you may have a serious illness." "Well, that would be the end of me, I expect," said Flare lightly, "and I don't expect my order of release for many years yet. If you could give it to me I should call you an angel of mercy, but I suppose there is no such luck. Goodbye, doctor, and thank you." She went out of the consulting room and through the wide hall and into the street, hardly thinking of what he had told her, because she was absorbed by the fact that he had risen to open the door for her. As Flare had said, her belief in the existence of gentlemen depended at this point in her life upon her publisher and her doctor, and when she felt incredulous, she sometimes made errands to go and see them and reassure herself. She was ruthless of their valuable time, but it was quite as much for a mental tonic as for a physical that she called upon her doctor, who charged her nothing by the way, and opened the door for her. Flare had come straight down for her latest interview with him from Fleet Street, where she had been to see the editor of an old and esteemed weekly. This person sat with his hat on behind his table when she was shown in by the clerk. He did not get up, and he left Flare to stand until she put her hand, with the finest suggestion, on the back of a chair. Then he said, "Oh yes, will you sit down?" And when the business was concluded, he had himself requested her to call upon him. He nodded her a dismissal and sat still while she let herself out of his office. After all, she had no just cause for complaint. He was perfectly civil over the business, and she was only F.C. the journalist. Flare went on to her doctor, and regained her respect for mankind. The little attention from the opposite sex was really as nothing to her, but she revelled in a purely aesthetic sense of the man's own courtesy. Flare always waited with pleasurable anticipation for the close of an interview with him, because she knew that he would shake hands with her and show her out himself. She received the same sort of benefits from her publisher, neither man being in the least aware that it could have been otherwise. Flare had her prescription made up on the way home, and then went round by way of Covent Garden in order to buy fish for R.L., so that she reached her rooms rather late. Whether she were tired or no, she never forgot the cat, or if she did, would tramp out again to get his supper, and cook it herself on the inevitable Beatrice stove beloved of Nous Autres, before she ate her own meal. In R.L.'s interest, Flare had learned many surprising things about the commissariat of her neighbourhood, where, for instance, they gave the really good scraps of meat for twopence, and which fishmonger would sell a cod's head with plenty on it. R.L. had perhaps grown fastidious, but only a stray will eat stale fish, and the fishmongers had begun to know Flare, and to give her wholesome odds and ends. She had no objection to carrying a weighty newspaper parcel down Bedford Street, and as she generally wore a sailor hat and a mackintosh on her shopping expeditions, It is probable that the shopkeepers thought that she was shopping for herself. It is certain that they were often good-natured, as they crammed an extra ounce or so into Flair's parcel. And yet they never treated her as one of the harassed women or thin children who swarmed round the doors on Saturday nights, waiting for free scraps. Flair had an invaluable manner that was misleading. It was gentle to silkiness, and when Nous Autres wanted an implacable hall porter softened, or a harsh doorkeeper appeased, they always sent Flair to interview him. There was a certain innocent friendliness about her which, taken in conjunction with her published books, was apt to startle people who had not experienced the grim realism lurking behind it. "Miss Caldecott has such a soft, sweet manner, you would never think she could write those stories," said one bewildered editress, who had expected a horny female with spectacles and a loud voice, and did not happen to meet Flair's betraying eyes. The soft, sweet manner had wooed countless fresh haddocks and slices of hake out of the fishmongers accustomed to give only trimmings for catfish, and R.L. flourished, though what he chiefly loved was to share a small rabbit with Flair, or a sixpenny pigeon during the shooting season at Hurlingham. For if you go down to Fulham when the pigeon shooting is on, you may sometimes buy pigeons for sixpence. And while Winnie lived at West Kensington, Flair used thriftily to arrange her periodical visits there, so that she gleaned a supper on the homeward route. "Perhaps I am seen at my best," she remarked pensively to Alma on one occasion, cutting up a rabbit's head. "I assure you that in R.L.'s service I have learned by now exactly how every bone fits in, and where each scrap of meat is to be found. I believe I could make a rabbit almost as well as the Almighty, and I can tell you just how much brain a codfish has, and how to get at the flesh on his cheeks. Codfish must be plump old people among their own kind." It is almost impossible to write of Flair without a supplementary history of R.L., because the big black tabby filled all the margin of her life that was left by work, and was the only masculine personality really influencing her. If her doctor had known the real spur to make her as cautious as he wished, he would have hinted that if she were laid up, R.L. would be neglected. But he had not had the privilege of meeting R.L. Stevenson in fur and whiskers, and so he missed a fine chance of persuasion. The prescription he had given Flair arrived in due course, and she remembered to carry it about with her for 3 days. On the third she had a threatening of her trouble, the old pain gripping at her heart and making her bend nearly double with the first effort to endure it. But she remembered the mixture and swallowed it, afterwards throwing herself flat on her bed, by which means the difficulty of breathing generally righted itself. The spasm passed off, and Flair congratulated herself on the doctor's remedy. As she had said, she was afraid of pain, and would have taken anything to avoid it. July had drifted into August, and still the heat continued. Flair meant to go away, but she was anxious to finish a heavy pot-boiler before she left London, after which she could take a holiday with a clear conscience. She had no attack for a week after taking the doctor's remedy, and it being some 10 days since she had seen him, her impression of the necessity for care was wearing off. She had not really been frightened, but the insistence in his mind had communicated itself to her, and she had mechanically done as he told her. Then, on this breathless August evening, she came in tired, took off her hat, and sat down to her supper in company with R.L. Even the cat did not seem inclined to eat, and after he had satisfied himself, he went out of the open window for a stroll among the chimney-pots. Flair left the sash flung up, that he might come in when he pleased, and taking up her manuscript and fountain-pen, she went downstairs to write in the room with the packing-cases, which being larger than her own, and not under the roof, was considerably cooler. The story was finished, and she was correcting the type. She hauled out a big dictionary, for her spelling was shaky, and took that too. When she reached the committee room where Nous Autres usually met, She remembered that she had left her doctor's prescription lying on her dressing table when she took off her outdoor things, but it was up 6 flights of stairs, and on the whole she thought it was worse for her heart to climb all up them again after her supper than to neglect his caution and not carry the remedy. Flare sat down to her corrections on a camp stool which she had brought with her, as well as the dictionary, using the packing case as a table. Outside the wide-flung darkening window, the faint sickly smell of the streets came up strongly, heralding rain. It came after some minutes, a few blood-like drops as large as half-crowns that pattered on the window-sill, then a quicker rush of a thunder-shower, and presently the steady, gentle hiss of summer rain, washing the stale streets and mercifully flushing the gutters. Flare looked up for a minute and thought of R.L., but the window of her room upstairs was open, and he would run for shelter as soon as he liked, so she had no need to disturb herself. R.L. had severely practical habits. He disliked a wet coat, and the only result likely to accrue from his outing were muddy paw marks on Flare's table and her bed. The rain did not seem to decrease the heat, but added a stormy savour to the atmosphere. It was an evil night, as black as midwinter and as hot as the tropics, pulsed through by the heavy whisper of the rain. The depression in the air lay like a leaden weight upon Flare's head, but she had been working for an hour, and was growing stiff and tired when she heard the front door-bell ring and Mrs. Bonnet's slow step going down the passage. A minute later Frank burst into the room waving a paper, and glistening with the wet of the outside world. "Flare, have you seen it? Did you know? I thought I must come round to congratulate you," she said breathlessly. "Seen what? Know who?" said Flare, ungrammatically in her bewilderment. "I say, Frank, you are soaking." She remembered with vague discomfort another night that had resembled this, a night when she had been working late and had looked up to find another girl in the room, with dripping clothes and a desperate, fair face to frighten the angels. "Never mind. It's a notice of X's on your storybook." "My dear, I am so glad. His criticism always means success, however late it comes. Didn't I say the tide was turning?" Flare took the paper in silence and read the notice. Her last book of stories had been out some 6 months, but a great man had only just discovered it, and given her a review which, as experience told her, would probably rouse the public in her favour. Her breath came a little uncertain as she read, and her heart beat. Visions of less drudgery and monotony, of life being a little easier perhaps, dawned dimly on her horizon. She asked no more. She had grown beyond the mere desire of enjoyment that drives young blood, and for some years now had done her work well simply for the love of it, and no hope of pleasure or reward. The intense anxiety about bread and butter, and the savage clutch at opportunity, which had at last landed Magda and Flare on the even lines of knowing that they would not starve as long as they went on working, had at the same time dulled the eager perception of life in them. The review that Flare held in her hands was slightly stilted, a little patronizing, but for all that it meant acknowledgment, and what she first recognized was that she might perhaps have to write less pot-boiling fiction in the year, if there were any profits from the book itself. For the acceptance and even the fairly good circulation of a book does not necessarily mean any great pecuniary advantage to the author. Flare calculated to lose on her books, because they took her longer to write by far than a novelette of the same length in paper covers. She lived by rough fiction, technically called slop, and freelance journalism, and wrote books with an anxious effort. Not until now had she even the hope that they would repay her in the present. A book was indeed a speculation that might prove a good advertisement in keeping her name before the eyes of the public. X's review might make it really profitable, that was all. "I stayed up in town tonight for a choir practice," explained Frank rapidly, "and one of the girls at the extension had seen this and told me, knowing that I knew you, and I bought it." "Hadn't you seen it, dearie?" "No," said Flare almost vaguely. "It's a good notice. I hope it will help me on, Frank. I'm so glad I was the first to tell you. We must all drink your health at the next meeting, as well as Alma's and Hilda's. I can't stay a minute, Flare. I only rushed round to bring this." "Thanks. Yes, thanks awfully," said Flare, but still in that vague fashion. Perhaps Frank saw that she wanted to be alone, and had said she could not stay, with a tact that was one reason why her friends loved her. She kissed Flare warmly, told her not to come to the door, it was such a wretched night, and vanished as suddenly as she had come, leaving an impression of her personality, like an unexpected glimpse of the sun at midnight. Flare stood still by the packing case after she was alone and reread her notice. She sucked it in to her innermost comprehension, not only for its praise, but for its blame, for she was, I believe, rather unusual in that she depended very much on her reviewers for her own improvement. The manner in which Flare studied the lordly remarks of some young man from Oxford, probably her junior in years, and certainly innocent of the long experience and hard work which had trained her to write books, was rather touching. When one of these youthful cockerels crowed out against the length of her stories, she condensed them religiously. When they told her that she was wanting in incident, she denied herself the analysis which was her forte, and crammed in action, whereupon someone else on the same paper reproved her next effort severely for differing from her first. That was the only thing that shook Flare's faith in the critics, the comparison between one reviewer and another in the same journal. For though she knew as a journalist how rapidly columns become open, and one man is replaced by another, she could not rid herself of the habit of thinking of a big daily as a voice, and regarding it, even in its book reviews, as a consistent critic rather than a series of individual opinions. The only thing on which all reviewers did seem to agree in Flare's case was her style, and as she had not the least idea what they meant, this bewildered her more than all their contradictions. Flare had no conscious aim at literary refinements. She knew that she loved Stevenson and Ruskin and all true poets, and read them from sheer delight in their facility of phrase as well as for that they told her. Pater worried her with his commas until she lost the sense amongst them, and she read most classics for what they said rather than the way they said it. The reason of her acquirement of that mysterious style, if she really had it, must have been by gift of a sensitive ear that could hear the form of a phrase even as she wrote it. Flare had only to read through her own pages to be conscious of the jarring word and the badly hung sentence. After a while she put down the paper with the review, and thought she would write to Alma and tell her. Flare had always told Alma the things that concerned herself rather than the rest of Nous Autres. Perhaps she would cut out the review and enclose it, if she could part with it. She wanted to gloat a little more, to feel herself suddenly and strangely known to one of those far-off beings who spoke to her so constantly and plainly in print, for X was a well-known man of letters, and who had become aware of her existence, just as if, while looking at the picture of some great and honoured stranger, it should prove alive and nod familiarly from the canvas, claiming an acquaintance. Flare felt herself at the same time one with her world as she had never been before, and yet set apart from it. The murmur of the loveless London beyond her narrow life came up on the hot August air, and floated in drowsily through the window, softened by the distance of the little side street leading to her door. The sense of the hard fight by which she earned even a right to exist seemed to press and press her back upon herself. It was a leaden weight, this vast crowd of men and women who were just beginning to listen to her, here and there perhaps. But for so long they had treated her as a stranger and an enemy that she could not get in touch with them. The vast indifference of the great city in which she lived was terrifying. It had cowed her, though she had not known it. For years she had not let herself think of the enormous silence that engulfed such lives as hers, or the impotence of her mere existence. When we come to consider it, almost all of us, were we driven to bay, would fall back upon the thought of another's personality, some human being in our private world, whose mere presence would at least prevent our going mad with loneliness. It is the sudden removal or death of such factors in our lives that makes us cry out for the relief of hearing our own voices. Flare felt her solitude suddenly, and heard the outer world rushing past her, buying and selling, marrying and being born, heedless of her and very far away. She turned almost eagerly to Alma's letter, with a desire to forge a link between herself and humanity again, even by a cursory little action. As she wrote the date on the paper, a sudden sense of weariness fell on her, as if the accumulated tire of the whole day attacked her, and made even writing a letter irksome. She was conscious of her own depression and of feeling ill, and with a gleam of ugly humour she expressed it to Alma after her own method, knowing that she would be understood. Instead of putting the number of the street, she wrote Hell, and added, "Please note change of address. Dear Alma, Frank has just rushed in on me, and almost tumbled over herself in the effort to tell me that X has written me a notice of the storybook in his paper. It is a damned good notice." Flare paused suddenly, a change coming over her tired face. The pen went on more slowly, wrote a few stiff words, and then stopped. "I was very excited for half an hour, and now the reaction has made me feel awfully ill." She rose abruptly, gasping over the truth of that assertion. The pain was coming on again, and she remembered that the remedy the doctor had given her lay on her table at the top of the house, up 6 flights of stairs. She stood hesitating a minute, while the horror grew on her. She was all alone in the room, practically alone in the house, for Mrs. Bonnet was in her own domains, and shut off from the room with the packing cases. This might be a slight attack like the last, but she knew that she had had a long day to handicap her. The weather was stifling, and the final excitement of the notice had done its work. If she could get upstairs, she might prevent the pain getting to its worst pitch, for it was really the pain that Flare feared rather than any danger. She made a few steps towards the door, but her own nerve failed her, or the movement made her worse. With desperate, trembling hands, she flung the dictionary on the floor, and lying down on her back, supported her head on it, to bear the growing agony with closed eyes. For a few minutes she lay quiet, trying not to think of herself, and listening to the insistent sound of the rain falling and falling through the black night. In her mind she saw endless processions of men and women forced to tramp through it, on errands like her own had often been, their stern efforts at bread-getting rendered harder by the little physical discomforts of walking where others rode, of going out in any weather where others could stay at home. Loveless London, a dreary waste, where stealthy hands laid snares for the women who walk with clean feet through the streets of experience. Winnie's face looked at her suddenly out of the phantom crowd, a white patch upon the wet night. Then it seemed to her as if the pain gripped her like a physical hand round her heart, until the cramp of which she had spoken made the perspiration hang in beads under her curly hair. Her eyes were still closed, but beneath the brown lashes were blue hollows of grief, and the same violet shadow hovered round her mouth. During the paroxysm she could think of nothing but the breathless horror, but as it faded away and left her for the moment half-conscious and almost nerveless. It flitted across her mind for the first time that this might mean death. If no one came to help her, and the attack wore out her strength, another such spasm would surely end it. Must she die like a dog on the floor? She turned her heavy head ever so little, and gazed round the half-lit room. There was no succour there, and she flung up her arms feebly, as if appealing to a higher mercy, in the attitude of one crucified. Claire had had no fear of death for years. She had spoken truly when she said that it was her order of release, and she should look on her doctor as an angel of mercy if he told her she must die there and then. It was not the thing in itself, but the method that horrified her. Claire had always been self-indulgent, and had loved the flesh-pots of Egypt. She had contemplated dying with stoical indifference, and would have met it so, but she had always fancied herself in bed, with Alma there certainly, to look at as a child will a well-loved face before falling asleep, and perhaps one or two more of Nous Autres to say goodbye. It would be just like falling asleep. She had always loved her bed and fancied herself lying with relaxed limbs until she fell into a beautiful unconscious slumber with no grey tomorrow to end it. That was the closing scene of her imagination, but not this fight between death and life, with agony that made her body moist and a sense of swooning rather than peace. To die like a dog on the floor. She tried to shift her head again and looked round her with asking eyes that begged dumbly, for she could not speak. As the inevitable end became clearer to her brain and seemed to draw nearer to her, she might have been resigned but for a last pang that belonged to earth, and hurt her as only earth's loves can do. It was not Alma over whom she grieved, or whom she feared to leave. Alma, after all, could speak, could appeal to humanity, had learned to battle with equal weapons in this hard world. But R.L., the old broken lines she had never finished, came back to her mind to torture her. Of Kurdistan, and how he loved the beasts, gods helpless whom he places on the earth, and says to man through those dumb mouths, "Be kind." They tell it in Pharisha to this day. She saw him, even the next day, going hungry. She saw him in fancy, wandering about the rooms with his beautiful eyes full of wonder and trouble, neglected, possibly turned out if Mrs. Bonnet found him a nuisance, left to starve and steal and be ill-treated, as man has always answered God's appeal, "Be kind." Gods helpless. The passionate, pitiful care for dumb things that lay at the root of Claire's very nature rose up and cried to a Providence whose place she had so often tried to take to them. Oh, surely one of Nous Autres, remembering that she had loved him, would make herself responsible for R.L. They were all so hampered by their circumstances that she dared not think it out in detail. She saw him always in fancy, hustled and frightened, and driven away while he still timidly searched for her and thought she had deserted him again. It took me 2 years to make him get over having been chivied and ill-treated as a kitten, panted Claire, trying not to see it all in her fatal imagination. Oh, if only I could make him understand that it wasn't because I wanted to, that I didn't give him up. The spasm in her brain was bringing back the spasm at her heart, and she held her breath. The pain was coming, sweeping over her. She opened her eyes, fever bright with it, and saw that an old horror had become incarnate. Inside the door, corporate, real to her dying eyes, stood the shadow, no longer the shadow, but a living presence. He came towards her where she lay, her hands flung upwards and nailed to an invisible cross of pain. The warmth and breath of his humanity was on her as he bent over her relentless face, and the eyes that looked on her fear had grown material. She was past speech now, but with a last effort she opened her clenched hands as if to show them empty, and made a faint gesture of renunciation. And so she went out into the darkness and the rain. End of chapter 14. End of The Pathway of the Pioneer by Dolf WYLLARDE.